the EscapeGoat podcast, a podcast series featuring the discussion of many different topics, flaws and all, based on personal whims and fascinations. Hosted by me, David Fagiani, and several different guests. I
did, yeah. I've read practically everything Pratchett has ever published.
Right.
Practically everything.
Right, okay. So you're in that end of the swimming pool.
Yeah, it was one of those things where I was sort of still in the swell, but in the latter days of the swell of my Tolkien obsession when I was a kid. And I found a copy of, I believe it was Equal Rights, at my local library, and just picked it up on the basis of the front cover, the wonderful Josh Kirby front cover.
Yeah.
And I have such a strong memory of sitting there and for the first time in my life actually laughing out loud all the way through a book. Just giggling myself silly all the way through. And my mum and dad going, what are you doing? What's going on over there, you know?
That is so interesting because I really, really loved Terry Pratchett, and I may not have read quite as much as you, but kind of certainly devoured the first, 20, 25 Discworld books and a lot of the other books when I was a kid or an early adolescent as well. And I never really, I loved them, but I never particularly found them very amusing.
Really, right.
It was always more of a kind of, I guess like a sort of dry appreciation of the wit and the characters and so. I don't mean that to make me sound terribly grown up and stuff. What I mean is I found them less funny than something like Douglas Adams, for example. You know, I always appreciated them, but I just didn't. In fact, sometimes I found the humor in them a bit kind of laboured. Kind of the stuff you have to get through a bit. You know,
to get to the deconstructions that he's making and whatnot. Yeah,
and the good, and just the really incisive lines and stuff. You know, I kind of, I just. But sometimes it comes across as a bit of a bit. You know. But,
Absolutely.
Equal Rights is an interesting one because it's so early on and it's sort of working it out still. You know.
Yeah, and I really rather like those ones where it's not quite set yet. Because there's like a lot of mythologies of its kind, there is this swell of enthusiasm there.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean in the kind of ones where they. I guess they go to the dungeon dimensions a few too many times, don't they? But there's stuff like sorcery, which is just so gonzo.
Yeah. Oh, sorcery is amazing. It does have this really sort of Lovecraftian element to it. It's where you really start to see what is at stake in this universe with regards to magic and its systems breaking down.
Yeah. Well, it just kind of. I guess I liked that one when I was I was probably about 10 or 11 or something. But I like just how. That one more than a lot of them comes across as something you can really imagine them doing a high budget megawatt adaptation of, in the way that some of them wouldn't lend themselves to very well.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because the attempts to adapt Pratchett have always been very difficult. Very, very difficult, particularly when they've gone with a sort of live action motif or medium.
They just don't work for me off the page, really, no. I think. Although not thus far, anyway.
I think the problem with Pratchett is a lot of the jokes and a lot of the points that he's making are so literate. They are based in written language, and unless you can do that physical thing of looking down at the footnote to get the punchline, it just doesn't work. I do recall there was a really, absolutely atrocious Sky One adaptation of. Which one was it? The one with the Father Christmas equivalent in the Discworld.
You're talking about Hogfather.
The Hogfather. Yeah. The Hogfather. It just didn't work. It just did not work at all. And it's a shame. All of the elements were pretty good. The cast was good. The writing was fine. It just didn't work. They picked the wrong one to adapt. For one thing, it was the wrong book to adapt. Of all of the high-concept Discworld books, The Hogfather is very, 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 very high concept and very difficult to communicate in that medium.
Well, I suppose they probably did Christmas special first, right? And then which one are we going to do? It was like the scheduling leading the construction kind of,
Yeah, and it's bizarre because, of course, The Hogfather is one of a series, and it's well into that series. the first one of that particular sub-series being Mort.
Yeah, but I had a weird experience with Mort because I read the Discworld ones pretty much in order, like old paperbacks, long after, many years after they'd first come up. I was a stickler enough when I was 9 or something to read them in order, and I read Mort when because my dad's parents died when I was quite young, like sort of 4 or 5, that kind of age. So it made an impact on me, but not so much as a conscious reading young adult in a way. But when I was reading Mort, so I guess I was about 9, my great auntie passed away, and so she was my granny's sister, and she was like our last surviving kind of like relative in the north of England, basically. Not last surviving relative, but last surviving older generation relative. And I was reading that when she was in the hospital. I was reading more when she was in the hospital and kind of coming to terms with, I guess, like familial mortality a little bit. It's really, I was literally reading it in the waiting room. It would have been a funny period detail to snap in a period drama, but
that is so apropos, isn't it? That is such in its own peculiar way, though. That is the perfect circumstance for reading that book.
Although I think Mort is one of the ones that I probably haven't reread in the longest time. I won't say quite since then, but I think it's just not one that's been like lying around the house at my mum's when I go and visit or anything like that. So I haven't picked it up in, I'll often pick them up when I go back to mum's. I'll pick up, Feet of Clay and read the middle third of it or something like that.
I mean, the ones I tend to go for are the Lanka books, the ones that deal with the witches. Because I love that sub-series. The characters are so endearing. The characters and the world that's created around them is so incredibly endearing. There was, of course, the Cosgrave Hall adaptations in the mid-90s, which are probably the most successful of the attempts to adapt them. I think it's probably, as a cartoon, is probably the way to go for the Discworld, if you're going to do it at all. And it's not terrible, actually. The Cosgrave Hall adaptation of Weird Sisters is all right.
I think it's Annette Crosby from One Foot in the Grave as Granny Weatherwax.
That's right. And perfect. I mean, like, absolutely perfect. The way they realise the 3 core witches, the design of them is pristine. It is absolutely perfect. Granny Weatherwax looks like Granny Weatherwax. Nanny Ogg looks like Nanny Ogg. And there's something very essential about those characters.
That's so, because I think I mentioned to you before that, I grew up, like without much exaggeration, kind of round the corner from Cosgrove Hall, from the old sort of studio in South Manchester. So it's kind of, I think for me there was the added magic of knowing it was happening around there, or at least was being planned round there. I've got no idea where the actual production was happening and stuff, but
Yeah, right.
But yeah, it was good. I like that. I mean, I was thinking, I never did this because didn't get around to it. But I was thinking, I think about 10 years ago, I was thinking about trying to become a sort of amateur screenwriter and just trying to sort of practice on things that I knew well as adaptations, just to see if I could do that. And I was thinking that one of the Pratchetts that would be really interesting to adapt would be Witches Abroad, which I really like. But then I was thinking, and actually this might be a good lead into very brief, probably, discussion of Candyman. But I was thinking, how on earth, I mean, particularly maybe as like a white writer, but like how on earth would you adapt Witches Abroad now? Because I think it's the sort of thing that Pratchett barely gets away with in like 1991 or something, and I was kind of like, I'm not sure if you were to do a visual adaptation of it now.
Well, how the trickiness of it is, how do you communicate some of those core concepts? So the notion that belief and stories in the Discworld are not inert. They're not something that just happens in people's heads, for example, or within the systems of culture. They have a kind of metaphysical significance and are coming true. It's a very, very, very hard thing to communicate without exposition. And Witches Abroad actually manages it reasonably well in and of itself. But how do you do that in a visual medium? I just don't know.
I think it might have that thing as well now where a lot of the stuff that probably felt fresh in the early 90s and certainly to me reading it in the later 90s would now seem a bit too road travelled in a way, like all the kind of fairy tale revisionism stuff.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, well, even if you look at, I think, is it Shrek 3, the one where the fairy godmother turns up?
Yeah.
That's essentially the same villain,
I
isn't
suppose it is really. Yeah, I'd not thought about that because I'm certainly not a fan of Shrek movies, but I was just thinking it kind of is a bit, though.
But it is, isn't it? It's the same villain. It's the fairy godmother who has an idea of how fairy tales are supposed to go and is trying to manipulate people's lives so that they fulfill those requirements. Yeah, it's the same character. It's essentially the same character, and as a result, very difficult to do now.
Yeah.
I always love the ending of Witches Abroad. I love the confrontation between Granny Weatherwax and her sister.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, that's
so
something because
good.
like now I'm a Doctor Who fan now in my adulthood, but I only really became a Doctor Who fan with Christopher Eccleston. So I had read. I was basically out the other side of my Discworld phase at that point. So in a sense, Granny Weatherwax was kind of my Doctor before the Doctor.
Yeah, pretty much. She's the same archetype, isn't she? Ultimately,
kind of. Well, with especially the whole kind of, she is it to some extent supernatural and can do stuff, but always prefers the sort of mental judo in a sense.
Yeah. The headology, as she calls it.
The headology, yeah. No, but I love that climax too. It's just I think it is kind of. I suppose it's like, to use the Doctor Who analogy, it's a bit like her kind of master storyline in a sense, isn't it? Meeting Lily Weatherwax.
Yeah, I mean, my favourite thing in the whole of that story is when she says to Lily, "You what? You didn't even enjoy being the villain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You didn't even enjoy it." And then she goes on this rant about how if she were the villain, if she weren't the good one, she would have reduced the entire disc to nothing by now. She would have been... I loved it, because what I love is what that reveals about her.
She's properly scary.
She wants, part of her wants it. That's what I like. Part of her wants to be the villain and knows she'd be so good at it.
Yeah. No.
She'd be so good at it, but she can't bring herself to do it because she's the good guy. She has the morality.
No, it's wonderful, and I suppose it's a bit like a more elegant, or to me, it's a more elegant version of the bit in Sherlock, on the rooftop where Benedict Cumberbatch tries to do the whole kind of, it's not good guys don't need rules, is it? Or something. I think that's a Doctor Who quote, but it's that kind of thing where he like finally succeeds in intimidating or at least impressing Moriarty by kind of convincing him. It's the I'm not, I'm on the side of the angels, but I'm not one of them, or something like that.
Yes, and that really is such a good encapsulation of Granny Weatherwax. It really is.
But you believe it with her a bit more than you do with Sherlock.
Yeah. In Sherlock, it comes off as grandstanding, and it feels like the writer saying it and not the character, Whereas with Granny Weatherwax, it's like, because you see bits of it come through. Sometimes, occasionally in those stories, she is really nasty, really unpleasant, and I kind of love it.
I think that was like someone tweeted the other day saying something that I think it was something like one of those theoretical questions along the lines of what job would you be really good at if it wasn't for your like principles that were in the way, and I think at least the implication was like left-wing principles, and I just tweeted back conservative politician, because I was like, I could do that.
Yeah, I think I said something similar. What I said was talking head grifter.
Right, sure.
Like the kind of right-wing grifter. I even know how I do it. I would set up a channel called something like The Reformed Leftist, or something like that, and my entire shtick would be, it would start subtle. It would be something along the lines of, well, I used to be part of these movements. I used to be part of the left wing, but... I saw so much, and I saw this, it would be almost like an internal look.
Cancel culture's going a bit far, that kind of thing.
Exactly that. Can
I get in on that if you ever do it? Because it sounds really lucrative.
And that's the thing. I know it would be lucrative. I know for a fact that you would start rising through the ranks immediately. It would be so easy to do. But there's not a chance. There's not a chance. I mean, my morals do hold me back from doing anything even remotely like that.
I think there's when I said the conservative thing, I mean, it was obviously in the way that hopefully most goodish jokes are. You kind of there's a bit of truth to it. And I was actually thinking about it, and I was like, well, I do have things in common with what I see as the traits of most high or low level right wing politicians, which is like things like I get impatient. I get impatient with solutions being quite complicated. You know what I mean? Like that, and kind of I suppose you could argue this is what makes me more anti-liberal than right wing. But the endless discussion of things sometimes gets on my wick. In a sort of work context or just kind of, I guess, when dealing with intractable social problems and things like that. It's kind of, I can see how there's a sort of kernel there of obviously you'd have to layer stuff on top of that, like apathy and insulation and all sorts of stuff like that.
Well, I think, funnily enough, I was having that very discussion with a friend of mine who is, I would say, probably far more concertedly left-wing in his politics than I actually am. And we were talking about how very often it's not a curse of being on the left. It's a curse of simply acknowledging reality as it is. Most often, situations are far more complex than we want them to be. They just are. And the strength of the right is that it provides simplistic answers. Even, they're not real answers, but part of the strength is that it provides what seem to be clear, concise, easy answers, which are often scapegoating. It's these people's fault, or it's that person's fault, or whatever. And that's part of its appeal in many respects. That is part of its fundamental appeal.
I don't disagree with that, but I think not to generalise too much, but I think that some of what right-wing politics does is almost paradoxically the opposite as well, because whilst it also does that, because it also sometimes pretends that there aren't solutions to things.
Yes. Oh, no, that's absolutely true. That's absolutely true. And will obfuscate and muddy the waters when actually there is an absolute and very clear answer.
Yeah, when it appears very clear to people who aren't part of that spectrum of politics that actually we could do A, B, C, and D, and it would it wouldn't make a perfect world, but it would ameliorate everything that we're actually talking about here.
You often get it coming up in this country when it comes down to taxation, obviously, or funding social programs. You always get the question, well, where's the money coming from? Well, we've shown you where the money's coming from. It's often insincere. That's what I find. The question is often insincere.
Yeah, well, as if the question from the people holding the levers of power was ever, where's the money? It's like, exactly where the money is. You've got our addresses.
Right. You know exactly where the money is, and there's plenty of money. We know there's plenty of money because the right-wing politicians keep spaffing it everywhere on nothing. Things that fail endlessly.
Yeah. Although, did you see even in this country, we're not doing the bridge from the west of Scotland to Belfast anymore. Did you see that? Apparently, Rishi Sunak had to draw the line somewhere. And he was just like, we're not going to do that. And I was like,
but there is a line somewhere. Well, that's a surprise for this administration. I've got to say that is a surprise because I didn't think there were any anywhere.
I really wish I'd been part of the consultations they'd done on that, because apparently they got in some like top level, like world class kind of architects, presumably, who couldn't have been cheap, and I don't think it's like free trial with those guys or anything like that, but I would have loved, because apparently it was like to get the feasibility of it. And I just would have loved to be at those meetings, or like Zoom conversation or whatever, where they tried to sum up the feasibility of it. Because I was reading up about it, it was like well, there's bits of the Irish Sea that are like 1,000 feet deep and stuff like that, and it's like high winds and hurricanes and stuff. And I was like, that doesn't sound like something humans have done yet. And I was like, and it turns out it isn't.
And you want this administration to oversee that?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Gavin Williamson could have done it, or in fact he could do it. No.
I mean, there's an awful part of me that almost wants it to go ahead, just so you can see the feeble, sort of half-built bridge that was abandoned as a marker of conservative incompetence.
You want to sort of
and
folly,
hubris. Yeah. It would be an excellent marker to the last 10 years of Tory rule in this country. It would be a fantastic visual metaphor.
Yeah, I suppose we could take all the lateral flow tests, couldn't we, and just kind of join them up together.
It'd be so many. Yeah, why not? There's so many of them.
Yeah, that we've got to do something with them, lollipop sticks, I suppose. Oh God. Well, you know what? Before we get too far away from the topic of revisionist fairy tales and everything like that, I mentioned to you the other day that my partner's successfully, it seems, got me into watching Adventure Time.
Oh my God, that's a rabbit hole and a half.
Yeah.
I'm telling you.
Yeah, well, I've definitely seen you mention it on your channel a fair few times, and but more in, I think more in passing than having done like a detailed take on it.
Yes, I haven't done any kind of detailed analysis of it yet. The reason being I'm intimidated by it.
Sure, yeah, I see why. I mean, did you go right back with it then? Did you watch it in the early stages?
Oh yes, I've watched everything now.
Right.
I've watched everything now.
But did you come to it in the... Was it the late noughties it started? It was...
I didn't see it when it was first aired. I sort of caught it a little later on when I can't even remember what it was. I may have seen it mentioned on YouTube a couple of times or something to that effect. Some people I like on YouTube may have mentioned it. And then I started watching analyses of it. And just when they started talking about the way it layers in back mythology, and it comes very unexpectedly. It's not, when you first start watching it, if you had no idea, you would not expect it to be a cartoon that even has back mythology.
Yeah.
You'd think it was a sort of silly, kind of fantasy based, but ultimately very silly, funny, almost Ren and Stimpy style cartoon.
Yeah, well, I thought it was a slightly more surreal SpongeBob. I suppose that's the impression I'd gotten of it. I'd seen the visuals of it, so I've seen what I now know to be Finn and Jake, in illustrations and things like that, and I was like, I see how that's cute and distinctive and stuff. I didn't really know much. I suppose, like, to use the old parlance, I didn't really know much of it beyond like the lunchbox designs I'd seen and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I think initially that's probably what it started as. I don't think there was any grand intention of making it more than that until much later on. But then there are these very, very weird episodes where the tone of the whole thing is completely different. It's much more dramatic. It has much more profundity. I mean, the one I remember that really shocked me was I believe it's a Christmas episode or something where you find out who the Ice King is. Mm-hmm. Where you find out that he's Simon Petrikov.
Yeah, I have got to that bit. One thing I was talking about with my partner was how on earth do I let George know succinctly where I am with it?
Yes, yeah. Please let me know, because I
can't.
don't want to.
I don't know how to. Because it's not that kind of show.
From that point, it starts to layer in more and more and more and more. The metaphysics of it, you need an encyclopedia to understand what's going on. There's so much. It's Tolkien-esque in terms of its complexity.
But there's also these little sort of relatively self-contained bits. I don't mean the backstory bits, although obviously they're interesting in their own right. But I mean, so one thing I just watched recently was the one where I read up about it. They're getting is it like a storied kind of Japanese animator to guest animate it, and it's the one that's all about the food chain.
Yeah.
And that one is like, I basically stopped because I was sort of doing other stuff at the same time as watching them and stuff, and then I basically I think I almost like dropped my mug, like I was at the end of The Usual Suspects or something. I was like, what on earth is going on? Like, I was like, it was really, trippy is overused, but it was quite something, and that kind of distinctiveness. But one thing I really liked about it, because I was thinking about trying to put it in its context of starting around 2010 and kind of going through the decade and stuff, and I was thinking, because it's very intense sometimes, and it's very kind of almost like disturbingly intense, not just the what's happening, but the kind of the intensity of the animation style and the sound and everything.
It actually has the feeling of an acid trip sometimes, like a sincere altered state of mind.
Oh, definitely, yeah, kind of. Because I guess I'm just about old enough to be an old Ren and Stimpy fan and stuff as well. So there's kind of there's almost like a more cutesified version of that going on. But I also was just thinking it's not really cruel. You know what I mean? Like quite harsh things happen to the characters sometimes. But it's not. And I have a lot more time for sort of, I guess what you might call cruel comedy than some people. I guess you might say on the left in general. Because for instance, Rick and Morty tends to be a very divisive show. And I basically, I think it's seen better days, but I basically think Rick and Morty is, fine, essentially.
Yeah, I'm quite a fan. I'm not a fan of the fan base.
Right, sure.
I think that's the problem.
Oh, no, I think that was the thing. That was the dividing line for a lot of people, wasn't it? I think.
Yeah, the propensity to take that show and to either willfully or just through sheer ignorance misinterpret it.
Yeah, well, just don't hero worship cartoon characters, probably.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's also a big thing.
If you're going to, do not take Rick. Do not take Rick Sanchez as your idol. I mean, for God's sake, there is an episode where it ends with him just about committing suicide because he's so unhappy. He's so unfulfilled in himself,
Yeah, no, I remember that one. I think that's the one where he's been dating Unity, the collective planet.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a great episode.
I was talking to someone ages ago about this, because I also followed the Capaldi era of Doctor Who closely, and that was kind of coming out concurrently with Rick and Morty's first 3 series. And and it's interesting, actually, because a lot of people who liked Capaldi's series quite a bit seem to really, really hate Rick and Morty, and vice versa. Because it was interesting, because I thought some of their episodes could almost have been rewritten as, well, obviously they could be rewritten, but they could be quite easily rewritten as the other characters. So the one with Rick dating Unity, I was like, you could PG-13 this, so to speak, and make it a Capaldi episode. You know?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it could even just be one of those little references the Doctor, certainly Capaldi's Doctor, sometimes throws into his past. Oh, I used to date a planet like this, or something like that.
Well, you just take out a lot of the overt sex jokes, like Rick,
which are, by the way, hilarious.
Oh, amazing! The bit where he's having sex with Unity in one or several of her forms, in a stadium full of representations of his dad, who are all cheering, all like big voices cheer. While he's hang gliding in. That's right, isn't it?
Oh yeah, I mean the way it mixes in all this Freudian stuff. I just love it. I love it to bits.
Yeah, no, I like it. But going back to Adventure Time. I mean, I'm definitely going to carry on with it, and it's been a fun thing to watch together. But it's I like that I've really got no kind of idea where it's going, or even if it's really going anywhere in particular in some ways.
Yeah, that's a good way to approach it. Actually, that is a good way to approach it, because when the moments come, and they do, they will start coming thick and fast. It will be jaw dropping. It will be what.
Yeah.
I mean, I know the one that really got me was it was in that episode where you find out that the Ice King is Simon Petrikov and whatnot. And that's the first episode where, when it makes reference to the Great Mushroom War.
Oh, yeah.
You think, obviously, because it's a world populated by candy people and by animated food of all kinds, you think, well, Mushroom War, maybe it was like a horde of like actual mushrooms. No, that's the first episode when you realise when it says Mushroom War, it means mushroom cloud.
Yeah.
And that's the first time you realise this is post-apocalyptic.
That's a good twist, isn't it?
It's so clever. It's so wonderful. And that actually becomes a key part of the mythology running throughout. So I love Adventure Time. What I'm finding really interesting now is because it did begin. It originally aired back in when was it? Like the 2010s?
I suppose beginning of the 2010s, about, yeah.
Now you can see its influence upon animation that's occurring now. So recently on Netflix we had Centaur World, for example. The influence of Adventure Time on that is overt. It's absolutely overt. You can actually feel the DNA of Adventure Time in works that are occurring now, and I love that. I absolutely love that.
Yeah, well, it's one of the scary things about living to be a little bit older, isn't it? Is that you start to see those kind of ripples and movements,
I must admit, I had one of those realising one's own mortality moments not too long ago. I was actually on YouTube, and I think I was watching either analyses of Adventure Time or clips of Adventure Time, and I made the mistake of going to the comments. And what I saw there were people saying, "Oh, I grew up with Adventure Time." And my immediate reaction was a kind of denialism. It was almost like, well, that's not possible. How could you have grown up with Adventure Time? It's a new cartoon. Well, no, of course it isn't. It's over a decade old now.
Oh my god. That's fine. I've decided that's fine.
Yeah.
Me and my friends were talking about this at a tangent, but me and my friends were talking, because we're passing through so many of those kind of 20th anniversary of our youth kind of things, of our late teens and early 20s as well as we'll go. But we were talking about, I was rewatching Garth Marenghi's Darkplace on 4OD, I think, or whatever they call it now. And I was watching it, and I was thinking that it's actually not that far off that being a 20th anniversary thing. And I was like, because then that got me thinking like how you'd do a 20th anniversary Garth Marenghi special, because obviously you'd have to keep the meta involved, so you'd have to do like the actors would have to be 20 years on from that show and stuff,
Maybe it would be a reunion of some description.
Oh, amazing! Like the Friends reunion, but like really budget,
Oh my god, that would be funny. Maybe they could do it over Zoom or something like that.
Yeah, or maybe like they have a séance to try and summon Madeline Wool. Or something like that.
That would be absolutely incredible.
Yeah. Oh, it's good fun rewatching that. It was kind of because you kind of when you haven't seen it for a bit, like I hadn't, you kind of forget like people who show up in it who are now really, really over familiar and kind of just part of the the British entertainment world furniture, who were really odd back then, like Noel Fielding.
Noel Fielding, yeah.
Shows up with
Julian Barrett.
The monkey bike chase sequence.
Oh man, that show! I mean, how did you discover it? How did you discover Darkplace?
I remember precisely. It wasn't that long after it was on TV, but what it was is that we had like a friendship group of about 4 of us who are still good mates, and one of us had seen it, or I think maybe 2 of us had seen it, but he'd bought. This is like, do you remember there's a thing where the BBC the Channel 4 didn't release it on DVD for ages, so he'd got like an illegal copy of it on a DVD-R,
right.
and it literally was like take it round to his house, and we all watched it. And I hadn't seen it on TV at all. I hadn't even like glanced at it.
Right.
So I was just like, what on earth? Like at late night, inebriated states. I was like, what the hell is going on? And then I got the DVD off him as quickly as possible, and kind of filtered it through there,
That's it. That's exactly it. I saw it when it originally aired, but I remember the night. I remember it so clearly. I'd been out and I came in rather inebriated and was channel surfing and just hit on this show that looked so ropey and so awful and so bizarre, and kept watching. And it didn't take long before I was hooked. It was a case of this is what I want. This is what I want to watch. And of course I started noticing all the little references to horror writers that I knew. There's a little bit of Clive Barker there. There's a little bit of James Herbert. There's a little bit of Stephen King, all mushed together. A little bit of Ramsey Campbell. Yeah. And I just, I fell in love with it. Absolutely fell in love with it.
I think I asked Kit Power this as well, but is there something that, because you're now a horror writer, is it sometimes quite hard to watch Garth Marenghi? Like, just as a character, is it like if you worked in a hotel, it would be hard to watch Fawlty Towers, is it?
There's an element of that, because you do sort of see, he is the ultimate pretentious writer. He's the ultimate pretentious writer. And sometimes I do catch myself in slightly Garth Marenghi-esque turns of phrase, and it's like, oh, stop it.
Do you ever say betwixt?
I don't know. No, I don't do that. Not in normal conversation. Nor do I misquote like epic poetry as much as he does.
You're allowed to misquote it a bit. You're only human.
Oh man, what is it he says? I know writers who use subtext, and those writers are cowards.
Yeah, that's a classic. Yeah. Well, the Dean Lerner line when he's he's talking about Madeline Wool and having disappeared somewhere in the Eastern Bloc. If she got a burial, but his line to sum her up is, in the end, she was like a candle in the wind, unreliable. That's amazing.
Oh my god! Have you actually watched the official DVD?
Oh, it's amazing. Yeah, I mean, you're preaching to the converted here. Yeah, it's incredible.
The commentary where they're doing it as though they are the characters and they've gathered around like Garth Marenghi's house.
It's just the best
sublime.
DVD in general. Like, it's just got the best extra features in, and all the outtakes of them doing the talking head stuff and everything.
It's so good. How serious it's taken as well, as though it is actually. I mean, I love the way it markets itself as though it is this lost show. That's high art and high concept. I just love that to bits.
Who's really good in those talking heads bits? Like, I mean, they all are, but like, who's really good in a mode that you don't really see him in much? Matt Berry. He's really because in the show obviously he's ridiculous, and they've like overdubbed him and deliberately, and he's on prime Matt Berry mode there, and that's probably how a lot of us discovered what the Matt Berry thing was. But in those outtakes and in the talking heads bits in general, he's playing a really. Do you remember he's playing a sort of like sulkily subdued, like almost like Uber Withnell kind of depressed alcoholic actor, and it's actually it's quite disturbing,
Yeah, there is almost like an implied story with that character, isn't there? Where he is an alcoholic, and he is not a very good actor, but he takes himself very, very, very seriously. Where he talks about like the craft and how natural Garth Marenghi is in this or that.
Yeah.
You know, it's hilarious, and always with a drink, obviously, always with a drink.
And I like the way that bits like, you know, that you might think that he's not as invested in the show as Garth Marenghi and Dean Lerner, but then you think he's kind of a bit above it, and he's a bit dismissive of elements of it, but then he's like, I looked at the effects back to this year, I was really worried they wouldn't hold up. They're great still, fantastic.
Yeah. It's like, no, really not.
I really kind of, I mean, I can't say enough good stuff about Alice Lowe in general, but I really kind of want, you know, I think the thing that will haunt me till my dying day is what happened to Madeline Wool. I think that's going to be the big mystery of my like fictional life. You know, it's just
it's the way they talk about her as well, where they talk about her in those little asides where had she kissed the bottom of the black goat in the woods? I think so. You know, it's so funny
because it could be anything from some sort of satanic, you know, incident to just like the sleaziest kind of ridiculous drunken mishap, or anywhere in between, couldn't it, given what you find out about them and what they hint at.
Given the nature of Darkplace, yes, it could be any one of those things, or indeed all of them on a spectrum.
Yeah. Well, the fact that is it like they make reference maybe at least 3 or 4 times to people who did die during the production.
Yes, during the filming because of toxic gases and paints and things that collapsed and all sorts of stuff. Yeah.
And there's always some justification for why it wasn't too bad. Like is it like, you know, well, it's, you know, you get one rigger on, you know, it's much the same as the other, you know, it's same tool belt.
There's always one waiting in the wings.
Yeah. And just not even the deaths, just like Dean Lerner's very rational excuse for why he had to hit a child and things like that. You know, it's just kind of. I think he just finished by saying, "I don't see it as a problem," and then it just cuts. You know?
And then like all of this subtextual stuff about how they had to throw the film into the Trent or something because Dean Lerner's club was raided or something to that.
Yeah,
just brilliant.
It's incredible, the sort of wider world that they managed to imply without you really seeing any of it, you know.
Yeah, it's so clever. And that character, I mean, what Matt Holness has really demonstrated in latter years, of course, is he's satirizing something he knows and loves. I mean, he created Possum, of course, which is a magnificent horror film. I mean, a genuinely magnificent horror film.
I've seen you talk about that. I've not seen it yet.
It's very good. It's very good. It is one of those films that's very British, very stark, and has... It's like, you know, like a lot of British horror, it is depression on screen.
Mm-hmm.
It has this oily grimness, almost like suburban grimness about it. It's so unpleasant. It's so unpleasant. I would advise, if you're feeling down, don't watch it. Do not watch it, because it radiates depression.
Right.
It's very good.
I mean, I was going to say that sometimes can be its own kind of quite persuasive endorsement, can't it?
Yeah, I mean, it does what it intends to do beautifully. I mean, absolutely beautifully. It's so well put together. He knows what he's doing. He is aware of how horror works, you know?
I'd really like to see it. I mean, it'd be interesting because, you know, apart from anything else, just the direction of Darkplace sort of betrays so much of that knowledge as well, doesn't it? You know, and it's that whole thing of is it the Les Dawson thing of like, you know, you need to be able to play or the Tommy Cooper thing really, where you need to be able to do something really, really well before you can make it look bad. You know?
Oh yeah, I mean, well, when you look at Garth Marenghi himself, he embodies so many elements of different writers that are so recognizable. He has to know about horror. He has to understand like the horror largely of the 1980s and 1990s, which is what he's satirizing. You can see the James Herbert, you can see the Clive Barker. I mean, he even uses turns of phrase that those writers use.
Yeah, and like things like rats driving a bus as like the conceit of a novel and things like that. You know, it's just, I watched it about 2 weeks ago, and I'm wanting to watch it all over again now already.
Yeah. That's the thing. It is one of those shows I almost try to limit my time on so I don't become overly familiar with it. But I could sit and just watch it on repeat, and I'd be happy.
Oh yeah. Well, I was that basically when I was 19, 20. that was what I was doing, and probably, you know, just as much of a bore as kind of the old Monty Python quotas and all that. You know. I meant to mention on the horror movie thing. I went to the cinema I went to the Prince Charles Cinema in London recently to watch Censor. You know. Did you?
Oh right.
Did you see it? Did you see that? Or?
No, I haven't seen it yet.
It's a young, I think Irish female director, youngish Irish female director whose name escapes me right now, but it's done a lot of the rounds of like the festival circuit and stuff, and it's on a more general release now. And it's it was weirdly resonant with me watching Garth Merenghi that week as well, because it is set in the 80s, and it's about a female film censor who works for the BBFC.
Right,
and who watches video nasties basically for a living.
Interesting.
And it's about what that does to her, but also it talks about some of the trauma that you sort of find out gradually, like some of the trauma that she's gone through in her early life and stuff like that, and then these films start having an impact on it. It's really I'm a bit young for the proper video nasty phase and remembering that properly, but my video rental, don't get me wrong, I'm not young enough to not remember video rental shops. It's just I remember this slightly more sedate after the Wild West kind of side of them,
Likewise, it wasn't until much later on that I found out about the video nasty stuff and Mary Whitehouse and all of that kind of thing. But I became kind of mildly obsessed with the phenomenon. I went back and researched it, read about it, watched interviews with Whitehouse and whatnot, because she kind of embodies everything I hate, like everything I stand against in everything I do. So it was fascinating. It was fascinating to see her. Do you know her organisation gave an award to Jimmy Savile for wholesome TV entertainment?
Wow. Well,
which kind of betrays it all, doesn't it, really?
I think the thing that dates Mary Whitehouse more than anything else is because it's not like we don't have those sort of censorious cultural conservative influences in British society, far from it. It's just that she had so much clout.
Yeah, that's the amazing thing, because she wasn't anybody. This is the most bizarre thing. She came from nowhere and she wasn't anybody. She was just really loud. Like really obscenely loud, and that's what got her attention. That and the fact that like right-wing forces in the UK were trying to find a crusade to latch onto.
Well, she probably toured like conservative associations and stuff like that as well, I'd imagine. She would have like receptive local audiences and stuff,
Oh my goodness, yes. I mean, and she was. I mean, you watch the interviews with her, and she is very eloquent. She's very persuasive. She never makes any good points. She never makes any. Often she doesn't make any points at all. But she's rigid. She's absolutely resolute. She will not move an iota from her positions, and just keeps repeating them and reinstating them. And there is a kind of weird strength to that.
I'd love to know what set her off. Not to simplify her views or whatever, but like if she saw something particularly heinous or something, or if it was something that no one else would strike no one else as impactful at all, right. And it just sent her kind of around the bend, because it'd be really interesting to know.
I honestly don't. I mean, what I found very interesting about her organisation, which I didn't know until recently, was that they were pro-war.
Right. Well,
they were massively pro-war. They complained about BBC coverage of both Vietnam and the Gulf War, not because of the violence it was portraying, but because they felt that it would undermine Britain's activities abroad.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
So
right.
They didn't mind actual atrocity occurring. They just didn't want people to see it.
Right, I was going to say there doesn't, in a sense, I'm probably being a bit naive here, but there doesn't seem much point in being pro-war. That's it, because that's just so much the status quo. It's like
right.
You don't really need to put another shoulder behind that effort, really.
No, you really don't. But she tried. Oh my God, they tried.
That's so interesting. That suggests such a weird pathological kind of veiled relationship with violence, doesn't it?
Yeah, right. So actual violence occurring is fine.
Yeah, because I'm a wimp on all. I mean, I've watched a fair few horror movies and effects-heavy horror movies, but I'm a wimp on every level. Yeah, I don't want real violence to occur. I'm not very good at watching extreme violence on film. I'm just generally a bit squeamish. Like at least I'm consistent.
Absolutely, yeah. Whereas this is just bizarre, given what she did complain about and what her organisations didn't want to see on television. The fact that they were pro-war is. I never knew that until very recently. I did recently another podcast with Max Booth III, who runs Perpetual Motion Machine Publications and the Ghoulish podcast, and we talked about the video nasty era, the whole Mary Whitehouse phenomenon and whatnot. Because of course in the US they didn't have this. This was a distinctly UK phenomena.
Yeah, which is kind of almost weirder. That's weirder that way round, almost, isn't it? I mean, given it's not like US politics in that time was like this progressive utopia or anything. Far from it.
No, you're absolutely right. It is strange. It is very strange. And when you consider, like yourself, I was a child in the 80s, so I didn't really feel it. I didn't notice it. But I remember going to video rental stores, and you know what? You could get what you liked. Most places had most videos under the counter or in some shady back room or whatever, regardless of what strictures were being placed on them. And what I did discover is that, like a lot of censorious movements, what she ultimately succeeded in is driving the appetite underground. So suddenly you are having like illegal screenings of banned films in universities, and most video rental stores had banned films in their repertoire. You just had to ask specifically for them,
which actually happens in Censor. That's a scene in Censor where you see that happening, and the furtiveness of it,
Yeah, and of course that furtiveness actually lent them more allure than a lot of them really deserved, because a lot of the stuff that she had banned is actually pretty shit, to be honest. It's not very good.
Well, that's the thing is, me being that bit younger, me and my brother saw some of those things on the shelf of just our local Blockbusters and Global Video, but they were kind of things like the Driller Killer, which was still, for kids, was still very impactful just looking at the sleeves and stuff, because they were, this was past them being illicit, really, but obviously for us as an 8-year-old or whatever, it was intensely illicit and odd and disturbing. But they weren't for anyone else, for adult society at that point, in the mid-90s, they were just there.
Of course, they were just like, you wouldn't even bat an eye, would you, really? I do recall when I was a kid, we managed to get a copy of The Evil Dead before it was on the video nasty list. So
oh wow,
we were very lucky to actually have a proper VHS copy of The Evil Dead, which I was most pleased about. I remember we had friends who were like, "Oh, you've got The Evil Dead! Oh, I've got to borrow The Evil Dead," because you couldn't get it. You actually couldn't get it on VHS for the longest time.
Was the ones that seem very not exactly vanilla, but the ones that are like part of the sort of firm, quite mainstream horror canon now, like Evil Dead, and I think was it Texas Chainsaw Massacre for the longest time.
Texas Chainsaw Massacre, that was one I did not see when I was a kid. One of the rare horror films I never saw when I was a kid, because we couldn't get it. You couldn't get it in the UK for the longest time, and I think the first copy I saw may have actually been illegal. Not to out myself or anything, but the first copy I saw may have actually been illegal. So I didn't get to see that until I was in my late teens.
Right. Well, I have to regret to inform you right now, George. I'm wearing a wire, and this whole conversation has been a long con to get you. I've been building a case for years.
You know what? I would allow for it, because it's been going for a long time, and it's been very well orchestrated, very elaborate.
Thank you.
Very elaborate.
Thank you. I'm just a pawn. I'm just a cog in the system. But thank you.
Done.
I'll pass it on.
I appreciate the Machiavellian nature of it,
Well, you are the dead, I rewatched Texas Chainsaw Massacre just last year, and I'm still absolutely fascinated with that movie. But the cliche of it now is, which is true, is that it isn't that gory or explicit or anything.
Of course, it's not. It's actually a very clever film in that regard. I mean, it leaves you with the impression that you've witnessed a massacre, that you've witnessed a bloodbath, and you haven't.
Yeah. Well, I think the most overtly gory bit is at the end when Leatherface cuts his own leg, right?
Yeah, that's about it. That is about it. There's the moment when they cut the girl's finger, so the old man.
Oh God.
Which is really gross and disturbing. But that's about as much blood as you see, and in pretty much the entirety of the film.
Yeah, it's got so much. This is like a whole other thing, and obviously I think it's one of those things where, as I say, I try and pick podcast topics that are at least, there's hardly any unbroken ground in terms of cultural discussion, but at least you can do things that haven't been gone over 20, 50, 100 times. Yeah. So I don't really see a point in doing a Texas Chainsaw Massacre one, but it's still one of my favourite movies, because I just find it so weirdly haunting and kind of spooky, and kind of, it's got that weird kind of verisimilitude and dreamlikeness at the same time, which I'm not even quite sure how you do that.
For me, it's intensity. There's something about the film that is riotously intense. It just builds and builds and builds, and then that's it. When it bursts, and it just keeps going. It doesn't have the rhythms or the structure of a horror film per se. It doesn't feel like a traditional horror film. It throws all that out the window and goes for an almost like punkish style, where it will just throw the scene where Leatherface first appears. It's what? Where does that even come from? It's not framed. There's no musical build up or anything. He's just there.
Yeah.
And it's phenomenally disturbing.
It's so amazing. I mean, the very end of it, you know, when Sally's actually escaped to the road, and there's like that first truck comes on, the driver runs out, and and Leatherface is chasing him around the van, and then another van comes by, and it's kind of, it's not quite at the sort of Blazing Saddles level of a film kind of falling apart into irrationality, but it's kind of like, it does remind me of genuine nightmares, you know, where maybe there's bits where you're just about to wake up, where you like the kind of internal logic of the dream is falling apart a bit, but it's still disturbing, you know.
It's fractured and strange, and it's like you say, it has no real internal logic. It just keeps getting more intense, and then it stops. It's the end. Because
in Texas Massacre 2, it's worn pretty lightly, but you know, he is linked to those characters, and there's kind of a revenge narrative and stuff like that. And I don't want it to be anything other than a nightmare.
Yeah.
You know, I don't want.
It has a beginning and an end. Once you've woken up, you've woken up.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I feel that more strongly than with most horror movies, I guess.
Yeah.
Although you could also argue that if Evil Dead 2 wasn't so wildly entertaining, you could also argue that Evil Dead is a good one for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also, interestingly, has a similar style about it. Once that moment hits, once the intensity starts, there are no lulls. There are no moments where it pauses for breath, as most traditional horror films do. Even films that are fantastic, like The Shining. The Shining has pauses for breath. The Evil Dead doesn't. It just keeps going and going and going, and battering the audience over the head with its strangeness and its violence and its absurdity, to the very end.
Isn't it weird that Evil Dead, I think this is partly because of the knockabout comedy particularly of the sequels, but isn't it weird that Evil Dead never gets thought of as a film with a bleak end? But it kind of is, isn't it? Like, I mean,
well, nobody gets out alive, do they?
The implication is that Ash is kind of, well, I don't know what the implication is, really, of that final zooming shot. You know,
is he taken by it? Is he possessed by it?
Is he killed? Does he escape? Is that just the start of it? You know, obviously in the real world, quote unquote, that's the start of another film. But you know, it's kind of I don't. Although actually, it sort of isn't, is it? Because Evil Dead 2 is kind of a weird, almost like remake, half sequel.
I love the way it works. I love the way the Evil Dead 2, it doesn't bother trying to explain itself too much. So, could it potentially be a sequel to the first film? Yeah, it is. You can read it that way. Bruce Campbell says in the commentary on the Evil Dead DVD, is Ash stupid enough to go back to the cabin with another girlfriend? And he says, yeah, absolutely he is. So
I never thought of it as a sequel in the sense that like that's his next summer vacation.
Right.
That's pretty funny.
So if you want to read it that way, you can.
Yeah.
On the other hand, of course, I mean, most people would read it as a remake of the first film that goes in wildly different directions. And then, of course, you watch the TV series Ash vs. the Evil Dead, which is fantastic, and that it melds them together.
Yeah,
there are flashbacks to both films as though they both occurred, but almost within the same time frame.
I think one of my favourite bits God, this is another podcast, isn't it? But I think one of my favourite bits in Evil Dead 2 is just that bit where I think it's just before the rest of the people turn up, the rest of the cast turn up.
Yeah.
And Ash is just alone in the cabin and everything starts laughing.
Yeah.
You know, everything starts laughing. Is it like the chair, the moose on the wall, the lamps? Yeah. It's just, and then he just starts doing that. You know, where he's laughing along too, but he's also doing that kind of like good old boy kind of hoedown kind of movement where he's kind of bobbing up and down while he's doing it. It's just like, it's almost like one of those manic movie moments in any movie I've seen. You know.
Yeah, it is the losing it moment, isn't it? It's the very edge of insanity.
Yeah, but it's losing it in a kind of Daffy Duck way almost. Isn't
yes,
it? You know?
Yeah. Which, given like the influences on Sam Raimi and Bruce Campbell, that doesn't surprise me at all.
Yeah.
I mean, they meld so many comic influences into the Evil Dead films. I mean, didn't Sam Raimi once say that it is essentially the Three Stooges with demons and blood? You know,
it's definitely that's definitely more overt in the sequel, isn't it? You know, there's a lot of OTT stuff that happens in the first movie and a lot of violence and stuff, but you know, and comic moments as well. You know, but it's just kind of it's all a bit more naked in the second one, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh absolutely, yeah. I mean, the second one wears its comic influences on its sleeve, really.
Yeah.
What I love, I mean, one of the moments I love in the sequel, in particular, it happens in the first one as well, but in the sequel are the moments of slapstick violence involving Ash, all of which Bruce Campbell did on his own. You know, there's no stunt people involved there.
Yeah. You know what? I was just thinking back to the end of Evil Dead 2, the one that leads into Army of Darkness, and I was just thinking about the main topic that we're going to cover on this podcast. And I just realised that it's another modern contemporary guy being sent back to a medieval fantasy world.
Actually, yeah. Very different implications, but yes.
Yeah, wears it a bit differently, it's fair to say. But
yeah.
Oh my god! I can't forgive myself if I don't mention this to you. This was literally a sort of Facebook ad I saw the other day. But did you see that Hellraiser game that's coming out?
Yes, the one that's it's an adaptation of The Dying of the Light. Yeah.
Is that? I know. Literally, I've seen the 30-second trailer, and that's all I know about it.
Yeah. So it's not necessarily a Hellraiser game per se. It's a mod for The Dying of the Light. It could be fun. So, it could be interesting.
So what does that, you know more about this than me, what does that suggest it is as a game?
It's not... there have been quite a few adaptations for The Dying of the Light. I believe there's a Texas Chainsaw Massacre one. I believe there's a Friday the 13th one. It's probably not going to be that in-depth, you know? It's not going to be like a full-blown Hellraiser game. It's just going to be like a little chapter or a little taster or teaser for what a Hellraiser game could potentially be.
So what is The Dying of the Light? Is it like a sort of horror anthology game series?
The Dying of the Light is a really strange, almost horror RPG, where it's borrowing heavily from the likes of Heavy Rain and games like that, where you have to make decisions, and the decisions you make spiral the game into wildly different story arcs and story trees. Mm-hmm. It's kind of interesting. It's one of those horror games where there's an incredible amount of replay value, because every decision you make has different consequences.
Oh, interesting.
It's quite fun. It's quite an interesting game.
That's so fascinating. I wonder if they've done any alien add-on stuff for that. I mean, I guess, no one dares to do anything like that, do they, after Alien Isolation? But, it's just
Oh, my God. I mean... Alien Isolation. I would probably not Let's Play that one.
Yeah.
Because I don't want people seeing me shriek all the time.
Yeah. No, but you would. I mean, my brother got that for the PS4, was it? Or whatever, or 3 it might have been even. But he got it, and I think we were going to my granny's house, I think, and he was like, let's play Alien Isolation. I was like, yeah, fine. And he was like, no, let's wait till everyone's gone to bed and play Alien Isolation.
That's a good idea.
And I was like, ooh, okay. And it was like, it was a bit, it was a bit illicit again, and it was.
I do recall playing it with a couple of friends of mine around their house, and we were so tense by the end of our playthrough. You could have removed the chairs from us, and we would have just stayed in the same positions.
Yeah, I hear you.
It was terrifying. It was absolutely terrifying. The only game I could think of that I've done that's even remotely close in terms of full-blown visceral terror is Visage.
Yeah.
You do hear me shriek a couple of times in that Let's Play.
One thing that I liked about Alien Isolation was, and I was thinking about this recently because I went to the cinema to watch the Wolfman, the 1941 Wolfman.
Oh, the original one.
Yeah. So I was thinking about I was thinking a lot about Universal horror, and I watched one of those like Mark Gatiss things about the early Universal era and stuff like that. Just treading well-worn sort of teenage ground, but I was sort of getting back into it. And I was thinking that one thing in retrospect that Alien Isolation is kind of in the glorious tradition of is those kind of son of movies. But it's daughter of, isn't it? It's daughter of Ripley.
Yes, that's right. The daughter of Ellen Ripley herself.
Yeah, but that sounds like a Universal Studios premise, doesn't it? Like like kind of like Young Frankenstein. Like she comes back to LV426 and takes meets Igor and takes on the family business and stuff like that.
It kind of is. I mean, a lot of people regard Alien Isolation as like the most sincere sequel to Aliens.
Oh, it definitely is, because it's kind of on its own. I mean, I think it's become a little bit. Fashionable in some circles to rubbish Aliens a bit more than it deserves, but because I like Aliens, I think it's really good.
Yeah.
But I see how Alien Isolation is a more sincere kind of continuation.
Mm-hmm. In terms of its horror, of course, yeah.
But I like the way they did it as well. I like the way they've wedged it believably in between Alien and Aliens without negating that relationship.
Yes, because it is very difficult to do, and there are other video games that have tried it, like Aliens Colonial Marines, for example, which resurrects Hicks. It just doesn't work. Does not work at all. Apart from being a very terrible game, unfinished. It doesn't make any sense. Does not make any sense. Whereas Alien Isolation, I think, understands the essential soul of the Aliens franchise.
Yeah. On the aliens thing. So we're doing Flight of Dragons in a minute. I promise.
Yeah. By the way, guys, we are going to be doing Flight of Dragons.
Absolutely. I think that's the first time either of us have said Flight of Dragons on the episode as well.
Yeah.
We're doing Flight of Dragons. I promise. One thing that I learned from my mate John while doing that Blackadder 2 episode was, the lady who comes... Blackadder. There's that episode where Blackadder and his crew become the executioners, and they chop the wrong guy's head off, and then his widow comes to see him, and they have to deal with her.
Yes,
so
Lady Farrow.
Lady Farrow. So she plays, and I did not know. Me or my brother are lifelong Alien trilogy fans, and we did not know this. She plays Newt's mother in the special edition.
Really?
Apparently,
I did not know that.
Well, why would you?
There you are. Well, oh, that is brilliant. In the same way, Captain Hollister from Red Dwarf.
Yes, I do.
He is the base commander on LV-426 in the extended edition.
I don't know if I'd clock that. That's Aliens has a large enough cast that it throws up quite a lot of those things.
Right. But how bizarre is that? He's the captain of the Red Dwarf and is also the leader of this little colony on LV-426. Could almost be like in universe, couldn't it?
It almost could. So that's presumably his last posting on LV-4.
Yes.
Well, I suppose both that and Red Dwarf are his last posting.
And Red Dwarf, technically, yeah.
He's quite a dude. Maybe they're brothers. There you go.
He's got a twin, and he also meets a terrible end.
Yeah, and they argue about whether it's worse to both work for the Jupiter Mining Company or the company. It's kind of.
Oh wow! Yeah. Oh, Weyland-Yutani would be way worse, wouldn't it? Surely.
Well, I don't know.
Yeah.
But that's true. Oh, with that in mind, let's take a short break.
Shall we go on?
Yeah,
Shall we go on?
We'll definitely will, but we'll move on.
You want to fly, don't you? To fly, you need gemstones. To get gemstones, you rob dwarf mines. Come on out, I say, and bring gems. Hurry now before we devour you.
You wouldn't really.
No, dwarfs, no. They're all sinewy and hairy. The meat you get's not worth picking out of the teeth. Now, swallow them down. Not all the way. Now, let them find your craw.
Odd sensation.
The phone is mostly in aid of the cast list, actually, because I was looking up a few kind of things that you might have done the same, but I was looking up a few things they had done or did afterwards. The voice cast of the Flight of Dragons, and there's a few gems in there.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, the one that stands out to me is, of course, James Earl Jones.
Yeah, blimey, yeah.
Having a ball playing Omadon.
Yeah, it's quite the performance, actually.
Oh, he's just relishing it. He's having a blast, Yeah.
No, so we'll get onto this, but I think the voice acting is one of those things that elevates it. Actually, it's much better than it needs. Well, no, it's exactly as good as it needs to be.
It's exactly as good as it needs to be. Yeah. I mean, it's an odd thing. I really like Rankin Bass as an animation studio myself.
Yeah, well, I thought you might have a bit to say on that, actually.
Yeah, I'm quite a fan. I remember there was also... They did loads of adaptations. I mean, Rankin Bass was a household name in the US before it was in the UK at all. It was a massive animation studio. They used to do a lot of things like Christmas specials and Christmas animations and things like that people remember very, very fondly. There's an adaptation of The Hobbit that they did that's quite well remembered. They also, of course, did The Last Unicorn, which is the Flight of Dragons sister film.
So their adaptation of The Hobbit, that's different from the... is it the late 60s, early 70s?
Yes,
Lord of the Rings
very
film?
different.
Yeah, okay.
Very different, yeah. The Ralph Bakshi one.
That's right, yeah.
Which is a discussion all of its own. All of its own. My God, that one, we could talk about that for hours.
Yeah, that's something I haven't seen for a long time as well. But I mean, before we dive into it, because this is by the way, this is episode 39 of the EscapeGoat podcast, everyone, as you probably saw from the show notes, presumably, wherever you get this. And this is George.
Hello.
Hey, George.
Yeah, I'm back.
We've just met again. We didn't do any of that previous hour. That was
fun. No, not at all.
No, not at all. Sweep it under the rug. But yeah, I mean, I've asked you in tonight to chat about one of, I think, our shared childhood passions. One of the sort of weird objects that I hadn't revisited in quite a long time. Would you like to tell me a bit about when you saw this for the first time and what the circumstances were?
my goodness, The Flight of Dragons, you know, it may have been... It certainly was one of the very first pieces of fiction, and certainly one of the first films I ever saw. Ever. It's certainly one of the ones that is burned into my memory such that I can replay it from beginning to end in my head. So did not have to rewatch it for this podcast, although I did simply for pleasure, you know, simply for joy. I remember watching it obsessively as a child. My mother taped it off of the television when it originally aired in the UK. I think it only aired once, and that wasn't aired again for years and years and years and years. Possibly on Channel 4, I don't rightly remember. But that video was worn out by the end of my childhood because I loved it.
Do you think it's a thing where like only maybe like 500 families up and down the country recorded it, but everyone who did watched it, you know, 1,000 times after that?
What I found later on, of course, with the advent of the internet, becoming involved in certain fan communities, is that this film it's lodged in a certain generation's memories. People remember it so fondly, and they remember being moved by it. They remember being afraid of it because it is terribly scary at points. Many people don't remember what it was called, but they do remember it.
Well, I can see it being the sort of thing... It's funny, it's so distinctive, but I can also sort of see it being the thing that you get mixed up amongst other things, because it has so many traits of other fantasy tropes and worlds and things like that kind of mixed into it or reflected a bit, you know.
Well, the film itself is really strange. I didn't know this until much later on, but it's not an adaptation of one book, it's an adaptation of two books. So it has the stuff from the original Flight of Dragons in it. The book, The Flight of Dragons, which is written by a biologist named Peter Dickinson, who also is still alive, by the way. I had no idea of this. He's still alive, yeah. And he is a prolific writer of children's fiction. The stuff that he wrote that I read as a very young child, like from the school library, I had no idea that he wrote it. Like, no idea until much, 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 much later. Like, around now, really, with the advent of internet research and whatever. But the book, The Flight of Dragons, is not a storybook. It's got no fiction in it at all. The book, The Flight of Dragons, is actually this really weird treatise on how dragons could have potentially existed in evolutionary terms. So Peter Dickinson was originally a biologist. He was an evolutionary biologist, and he was bored. He was just bored with his field. He was really, really weary of it. He had this fascination with fantasy and with dragons. And you know where The Flight of Dragons came from?
What, the term?
Yeah, the core kernel for the book, for the concept.
Well, the book's kind of about him trying to work out how that would work, right?
Exactly, yeah. He was on a train journey, apparently, and he was marking, like, papers, because he was a professor at the time, and he was bored. He was so bored. And he pulled out a copy of Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea novels. And on the front of it was this dragon. And he started thinking, you know, being an evolutionary biologist, he started thinking, well, it couldn't fly. It's too big. There's no way it could get off the ground. So how would that work in biological terms? And he started thinking about like similar examples in nature of the mechanisms that creatures have to allow them to fly. And from that came this entire book that involves different cultures' mythologies about dragons, different dragon stories from across the face of the world, and also his own ideas on how you could potentially fit dragons into evolutionary biology. Now, he's not sort of like cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. He's not actually saying that dragons existed. He's not saying that. No, it's an exercise. He's trying to create a sort of fictional thesis on how dragons could have existed in evolutionary terms. So he even explains things like why there are no fossils of them.
Yes, I saw that. Is it because like the high level of acidity would dissolve their bones?
That's it. Their bones oxidize because one of the things he comes up with, the mechanism for their flying is amazing, which is in the film Flight of Dragons. Of course, you get this entire explanation of how they have this sort of honeycomb of bone and muscle in their bodies, and they eat limestone, which reacts with their stomach acids, forms hydrogen, which is captured in these cells, and they expand like balloons and go up.
Isn't that weird that it makes him a kind of weird, in a sense, reverse creationist?
In a weird, yes.
He's sort of trying to prove that giant saurian things did walk the earth when they probably didn't.
Although he's not, he makes he makes it explicit at the beginning of the book that this is fun. I'm just doing this as a fun exercise because I'm bored with what I'm doing. And this book was published and it actually became very, very popular, The Flight of Dragons. But the film takes those concepts and those elements, and even Peter Dickinson himself, because he's actually in it.
So weird. That's so. I want to get back to that in a bit.
That's
odd.
That is bizarre. I mean, that is really strange. And also another book called, bizarrely called George and the Dragon, which is by an author I cannot even remember his name, but that is where.
Oh, I've got it here. The Dragon and the George by Gordon R. Dixon.
That's the
even
one.
More confusingly.
Yes, that's the one, and that is where the story comes from.
Well, that is like, I'm trying to think of a fair analogy here. That is like if you adapted Lord of the Rings quite close, with changes, but quite closely. But you called it Game of Thrones, and the protagonist was George R. R. Martin.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's so weird.
Conceptually, it's a weird thing. Well, I mean, it leaves you wondering, why didn't Rankin Bass just adapt The Dragon and George? If that's what they wanted to do, why didn't they just adapt that? But
it's so strange, and what I was going to say is, it kind of as neat as a metaphor is, how a key point in the plot of Flight of Dragons in the film is about the merging of two creatures.
Yeah,
that's weird.
That's very strange, isn't it? The notion of Peter Dickinson, who in the film is the author Peter Dickinson. So he is the biologist, he is the student biologist who is also obsessed with fantasy and whatnot, who gets sucked into his own world. There is even a sequence in The Flight of Dragons where Carolinus, the green wizard, is showing Peter Dickinson around his library, right? And Carolinus's library is the library of unfinished books. And he pulls out a copy of The Flight of Dragons that is actually the original copy with the original cover of the actually published book.
I remember that bit from childhood as being weird even then.
Yeah.
When in a sense the movies you see over your first sort of 7-8 years aren't weird because everything's weird.
Because it informs what becomes your norm. Yeah, it becomes exactly.
But then even then I think I was like as a 6-year-old or whatever, I was like, what?
Yeah.
What?
There's a lot I mean, this is obviously long before the term meta was ever really a thing, but it's so meta. Isn't it? It's a commentary. The film, and this is a children's film, by the way. This is aimed squarely at children. It's a very complex children's film, but it is a children's film. It not only comments upon the nature of fantasy and imagination, but it has this weird interlocution between reality and written fiction existing together and informing one another.
Well, it's so funny because, we were talking about Pratchett a little bit in the preamble. I was thinking the scene where Gorbash, and I'm going to say Peter as... where Smeargle and Peter as Gorbash, but I will say Peter and Gorbash interchangeably beyond a certain point, where they're talking about the mechanics of Dragonfire and how you have to, crunch up jewels to provide the lift and all that sort of stuff. It reminded me a bit of, in Guards, when they have these like swamp dragons, that they that Pratchett kind of gets a bit into sort of that I guess Dickinson inspired stuff about how they could really fly, but they differentiate that from real dragons, in the sense that swamp dragons are sort of vaguely believable, kind of runtish things.
Isn't that
whereas
weird?
Real dragons are impossible even on this world, and they kind of make a point of that.
Yeah, in Guards, it makes a point that like the big dragon is like an extra dimensional entity, isn't it? It's from somewhere else where the rules of physics are different, essentially. But no, I mean, I love the fact that the explanation that Peter Dickinson provides as to how dragons could function, with all the qualities and characteristics that people regard as quintessentially dragon-like, could have worked. They could have functioned. They could have breathed. They don't really breathe fire, for example. They just look like they breathe fire. What it is, it's the gases that they build up in their bodies expelling, and then there's an organ in the roof of their mouth that generates a spark. So it ignites as it's coming out. But the ability to breathe fire is linked directly to the ability to fly.
what I think's amazing about that in the film is the way, because you could easily have Carolinus, the wizard, explain all that. But what I love is they put most of it in the mouth of Smeargle, the crotchety old dragon, who is kind of annoyed that he has to explain any of it.
Yeah, and I love the fact that he just, like, his explanation is the adult explanation. We're dragons, and dragons breathe fire. And Peter is the child, and he's like, no, that's not good enough. I want to know why.
Well, isn't this fascinating, right? Because we'll get into this, but the kind of blending for a film primarily enjoyed by kids, right, and certainly us as kids, the blending of kind of the rationalist with the childish person, or the unworldly person, it's significant, unworldly in this world, with and kind of the kind of interesting mess the film makes of that.
Yeah.
Isn't that an interesting hook into it?
Yeah, it is fascinating. I mean, one of the central theses of this film is it's not just the contrast between rationalism and fantasy. It's actually the interplay between them. I mean, Carolinus actually points this out at the beginning, when the wizards have their council. What's essentially happening is the world of imagination, the world of fantasy is dying. And it's dying because human beings are basically losing their capacity to imagine, to fantasize. So there is an entire commentary going on there about civilization, about capitalism, all sorts of things. You could read any number of readings into that. But what Carolinus points out is that humanity needs imagination, it needs fantasy to inspire itself. It's not the case that rationalism and science are separate from these things. They inform one another. They are expressions of one another. And I love that. It's such a complex notion for children to grapple with. It's one of the things that
makes it feel quite mature, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like it's quite rounded.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. And on the extreme side of that, you have Omadon, of course, the Red Wizard, who is trying... He's not trying to crush the rationalism of humanity. He's trying to warp it. He's trying to warp it into something dark and cruel and malevolent and warlike, so that ultimately humanity destroys itself and the world is free for him again.
He certainly is doing that, but it's also that kind of slightly understandable villain behaviour where, I was thinking of maybe comparing him to Skynet, because he's that sort of force that kind of has realised how dangerous humanity is, particularly to them, he is protecting himself, but also the world that he's of.
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? Because Omadon does become, at the end of the film, and he says this himself, the source of all magic. He becomes essentially the manifestation of wild, unbridled fantasism. And it comes down to Peter having to deny that, ultimately.
Yeah, well, it's almost like he's Omadon, because the whole thing is like, the quote-unquote good wizards, team up as much as they can to bring down Omadon.
Yeah.
But it's almost like Omadon himself is trying to fight a kind of, I guess you might say, misguided and ungenerous, but kind of glorious last stand, right?
There is an element to that, isn't there? And also, I mean, you have to bear in mind, the wizards are elemental. They are informed by their natures. So Omadon really is acting according to his nature. I mean, Carolinus says this. I mean, his adopted daughter, Melisande, says to him of Omadon, why would antiquity force you to accept something as abominable as Omadon? And Carolinus says, well, he is the darkness. He's the evil. He's the dark side of things, and it's part of everything.
It's funny, I said I was recording about Time Bandits recently. I'd love it if he was like, he wrapped his brain, he was like, I think it's something to do with free will.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's fascinating, isn't it, that Omadon knows all this. At the beginning of the film, Omadon is absolutely aware of everything that's going on before the others are.
I think Omadon was one of the most terrifying villains I'd encountered at that early age.
Yeah.
As you sort of mentioned briefly before, he's voiced by James Earl Jones, and obviously it would have been around the same time I was watching the original Star Wars movies.
Of course.
But there's more. I mean, the voice he's not just doing Darth Vader here, is
no,
he? It's
not.
quite theatrical.
He really isn't, and I imagine that must have been the temptation at the time. If you're playing a big villain in a mythological fantasy, then obviously the Darth Vader voice would have been fine. But no, he doesn't. He goes for something much more passionate here. Omadon has incredible range, I find. At times he speaks very low and threatening, and then he has these incredible soliloquies where he's just exploding with passion.
Well, my most indelible memory of the film, actually, as a sense memory, is probably quite a common one. Is the bit? It's probably in the last 25 minutes. Is the bit where he launches his attack on them with the flight of dragons, and he just shrieks the flight of dragons. It's kind of, and he does it twice as well, but the second time's bigger.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, I really that took me of all the there were so many details I'd forgotten because I've not seen it as recently, but that really took me straight back to being a 6-year-old.
It's epic, isn't it? It is genuinely epic because, of course, Omadon takes control of all the dragons in the world. I mean, he is effectively becoming the source of human imagination, isn't he? He's becoming like the epicenter of it. So his influence is extending across all of reality at that point. Yeah, and he shrieks, doesn't he? The flight of dragons. It's brilliant. It really is amazing.
Well, I guess we'll talk more about the production and stuff, and the budget of it and stuff, and the limitations of it. But I mean, how is it so possible that this obviously is partly on nostalgia, but how is it possible that scene seems so epic when it also looks so cheap?
Yeah,
and I do mean that kindly,
Yeah, I mean, the funny thing about Rankin Bass, it was one of the lesser animation studios, of course, at the time, and always has been. It's always worked according to a budget. But what that has allowed it to do is develop this very particular in-house style. So a Rankin Bass product when you see it. If you watch The Last Unicorn, for example, which is the sister film to The Flight of Dragons, it looks like it could be set in the same world.
So what do you mean by the sister film? Because I didn't have the chance to look into this properly, although I saw it mentioned in a lot of the Rankin Bass summaries.
They were produced around the same time, and they were released at around the same time, and you can tell that they used the same animators.
Right.
You can really tell. They could be set in the same universe so easily.
It looked very a lot of the animation in this, I'm thinking particularly of the kind of face structures of the characters in particular. I think Metal-san for some reason impressed me most this way, but the kind of they seem like they could have come from a Japanese studio at the same time, and there was some overlap, right?
Yeah, I do believe so. I mean, it has a sort of almost Studio Ghibli-esque quality about it,
like a kind of proto one, yeah.
It's unusual. It is not what people would recognise at the time as being big budget animation, because it just isn't. It just isn't. They use a lot of tricks to get around that fact, but it's so heavily stylized that actually that lends it a certain patina, doesn't it? It has a certain appeal all of its own.
Well, it's interesting that it comes out kind of in the, I guess what's now looked back on as the kind of Disney animation cultural nadir as well, isn't it? Because it was this around the time of things like the Black Cauldron, and maybe a bit before the Fox and the Hound, and before what's now kind of commonly known as the Disney Renaissance had taken hold.
Of course, yes. So this was definitely pre The Little Mermaid, definitely.
So there was almost a bit more cultural space. I mean, I don't mean this in an old man yelling at clouds kind of way, but I mean there was maybe a bit more cultural space for other things, as there now is as well, because Disney is not in the same. Well, Disney is now a dominant cultural force, much more than it ever could have been then, but not in the same way.
Yeah, you're absolutely
not in the same aesthetic way. But so there was a bit more space for stuff like this, I guess.
Absolutely, yeah. And unfortunately, I do believe those two were the last Rankin Bass films as well. They were the swan songs of Rankin Bass, which is a great shame. It would have been nice to see what Rankin Bass would be producing now.
Am I right in saying that they got into you know more about this kind of epoch of animation, but they get into Thundercats?
I do. Yes, they actually produced a lot of the animation for Thundercats, and certainly the backgrounds. And if you look at the backgrounds of the Thundercats cartoon, and look at the Flight of Dragons, sometimes there are some reused.
Right.
Yeah,
okay.
There are some reused, particularly like forest scenes. You will see a lot of reused and recycled backgrounds in Thundercats from these films.
That's so interesting. Is it Arag in this, the sort of wolf creature? I think when he turned up about halfway through the movie or just before that, I was kind of like, this feels a bit Thundercatsy.
It does have a Thundercatsy thing going on, Arag. Yeah, definitely. And again, it's one of those weird things. I've never read the storybook that it's based on, so I don't know. But there are the story is very strangely structured. Like characters just kind of turn up. And you just go with it because of the nature of the story, because it is this sort of dreamlike fantasy. You just kind of accept it. So yeah, there's a talking wolf. Fine.
Well, it's funny you say that. Like the bit where Arag turns up and takes out the what they called the sandmerks.
Yeah.
We'll talk about them more in a minute. But like that bit was funny because he turns up and he does his heroic thing, and then it turns out he knows some of the characters and stuff. But then he's kind of like almost like one of the characters is like, "How did you get here?" And rather than just say well, I turned up, I'm a wolf, I do
Yeah,
heroic
yeah.
things. He's like, well, it's actually kind of weird, and they get into this kind of
long
backstory. It's not even that long, but it's just so strange and kind of unnecessary.
Yeah.
Because all you really need is heroic wolf character
Yeah.
shows up and does something badass. But it's like, well, actually, I was drowned because there was this previous mission, and I'm actually kind of undead.
Yeah,
and all this happened kind of off to the side of this plot.
Yeah, so he's not just a talking wolf; he's actually an undead talking wolf that's trying to get the capacity to breathe back.
He's like a water spirit powered undead talking wolf
Yes.
that has turned up at the story of the nick of time because he was sent by the Blue Wizard, and it's kind of like that's gloriously unnecessary.
I love it though, don't you? I absolutely love those little fluff elements that the film has. It's something I love in storytelling anyway.
Well, I was thinking it kind of felt a bit like if you did an adaptation of Lord of the Rings, but you didn't meet Gandalf until he came back as Gandalf the White.
Right, yes.
Because just like everyone's like, Gandalf, where have you been? And he's like, well, long story.
Well,
and then
let me tell you. Sit down, children. Gather round.
And you'd be like, who is this guy?
Yeah, what's going on here? Yeah.
But I loved it though.
And he's also framed. I mean, when you first see Arag, you see him in the background, and it's before he actually meets Peter in Gorbash and Sir Oren Neville Smythe, the knight, and he's framed as though he's going to be a threat. You see him lowering out of the bushes at them, and you think, "Ooh, that's going to go wrong." And of course, it's not. He's actually a good guy.
I love Neville Smythe. By the way.
Sir Oren Neville Smythe is fabulous. I absolutely love him. The quintessential knight.
He's a bit like something from The Sword and the Stone or something, isn't he?
Very much so. When you think of like an Arthurian knight, it's him. It's Sir Oren Neville Smythe with his spiky nipple parts on his armour.
How is he such a ridiculous, lovely, almost like Holy Grail-esque character, though? And then yet his sort of final stand against Brielle the Dragon is genuinely epic.
Epic, isn't it? It is epic. It's because he sells it, isn't it? I think what it is that there's no ambiguity in Sir Oren Neville Smythe. There is absolutely no ambiguity whatsoever. He is an archetype, and because he is such an archetype and played with such verve by the voice actor, you go with it. You just run with it. Yeah.
Some sort of quest, returning from a crusade, perhaps. I suddenly spied a rather smashing sight. A nest of dragon's eggs. Well, I was about to do a charcoal sketch when who showed up but Preamble. Began to sup on the next generation, as it were. Hold and get ye hither, or prepare to die! Rather good blow, if I do say so. Must have been half an hour before I opened my eyes. And when I did, I found he decimated the entire litter, save one. Well, it seemed a shame to die for an egg, but I'd made the challenge. Laws of chivalry and all that, you know. Bit of this, bit of that. He had me, I had him.
This is what he is. He is this goodly, wholesome, pure, perfect knight. And he's wonderful.
Yeah. But isn't that also, we were talking before about where maturity runs weirdly into immaturity, because there's that thing where he is that, but like a lot of sort of chivalrous characters, he is kind of childlike as well. And there's even just the niceness of him plays into that naivety in some ways, doesn't it? Because he talks about, it could be a whole subplot about how him and Peter are, jealous over Melisandre to each other. But he's like, well, I kind of arbitrarily decided I'd be in love with Melisandre. And not even then, I didn't even really fall in love with her. I was like, well, one day when she's old enough, I will be in love with her. I'll almost like try to be in love with her. And then then Peter's like, oh, I'm so sorry. He's like, oh, no, never mind.
He's sort of like, well, no, I think he says something, oh, you're lucky, well done to you.
It's the most large-hearted thing, isn't it?
And again, you get these wonderful bits of backstory for him that are almost really redundant. You don't need to know about the backstory between him and Breag. You don't need to see that.
That bit's great, though. That's another bit where it's just like, it's just... You know what? This is weirdly tying into Adventure Time more than I thought it would, actually. These like little sidebars where they just do something completely mad for about 10 minutes, and then you get back to the plot, and it's just like, whoa, okay, I didn't know that character had been there. Yeah, because that bit's amazing as well, because that turns out to be the sort of origin story for how
for Gorbash. Yeah, of course.
And again, I was like, I didn't think I needed an origin story for Gorbash, but there we go.
It's also one of the weird bits of Disturbia that the film has. There are these unspoken, very quietly framed bits of Disturbia in this film, where Breag is eating the eggs.
Yeah, he's a cannibal.
It's like, what? I mean, I know that Breag is supposed to be like the devil dragon, so he is the epitome of all negativity. But even so,
yeah, it's disturbing, and you'd have that as a threat in another film, maybe not have it just happening. And I really love, because I think, as I was sort of saying, the voice acting is generally really good and really memorable and carries loads of this movie. But I think at least bits of the script are weirdly good and personality filled as well, because there's that bit where Neville Smythe is fighting Breag in this flashback and he's narrating it sort of calmly, which makes it all hilarious, that these epic kind of sword and sorcery things are happening, but he's summing it up. He's just like, well, because he's like locked in a death embrace with Breag, and he's like, well, he had me, I had him. And I was just like, that was the line that stood out.
The whole story is framed like that as well. Like at the beginning of it, he says, oh, a few years ago I was mucking about in Obadon's Red Devil realm, or whatever the hell it is.
Yeah, like he's clearing the attic
right, because he's a knight and that's what knights do. They muck about on quests in places,
He says he was on the way back from a crusade
just
or
something. Yeah.
It's like, which opens a lot of weird questions about how this world has crusades. It's kind of, but yeah, it's just so lovely and vague.
It's so casual.
It's almost like he's just made up something that sounds like he should have been doing.
Yeah, it's so casual, and I love it. he lends heart to the whole endeavour, I find, Sir Oren. And he's lovable. He is absolutely lovable. His last stand is one of the highlights of the film.
But in its own way, it's kind of as the implications of it at least are kind of as horrible as stuff from George R. R. Martin, aren't they? Because he's kind of like baked to death in his own armour.
Yeah.
But in a way that he realizes he can kill Breag with it, and it's just one of the things I really liked about this movie, and I'm trying to tie it to other stuff that I was into as a young kid, was I think we mentioned before in one of our chats, like Captain Planet. Because I was exactly the right age for Captain Planet. I was really, like a lot of kids actually, I was really fascinated by kind of elemental stuff.
Yeah.
I don't mean like, when I got a bit older, I was fascinated by actual elemental stuff as well, like chemistry class. But I mean, the 4 element stuff, and I think there was something about as you sort of mentioned before, the structure of this world where it's represented by what you might call the cardinal wizards.
Yeah, I mean, the wizards are really strange, aren't they? Because they're not wizards per se. They're more like demigods, aren't they? They are the personifications of the aspects of this world. They're not. It's not just the case that Carolinus is the green wizard and therefore he's the forests and whatnot. That's not really it. He's nature and balance. Lotajal, the yellow wizard, the golden wizard, light and air and healing and contemplation. It's kind of beautiful.
Well, their sort of non-direct intervention makes them feel more like gods, doesn't it, as well? The fact that they can't directly go against Obadon because you're not even sure what that would look like.
Right.
Could they beat him?
It's
forbidden.
It's
just not the done thing.
Yeah, it's forbidden. I mean,
but you're like, who's forbidding it is the question. I mean, you get that question with all these kind of mythologies, don't you?
What is the overpower? I mean, Carolinus talks about antiquity always, as though it's the overarching power. So it's like, it seems to me to be another way of saying reality. It's like,
well, it's another way of saying the deep magic, isn't it?
Yeah, the deep magic. Yeah, so creation itself forbids it. They can't war on one another because they are the pillars of creation. It would just cause everything to topple down.
Yeah, no, I mean, it does feel like that. And there's just something, when I referred to them as cardinal wizards before, I was thinking there's a bit where, I think it might be that library scene, actually, where Carolinus mentions the Wizard of Oz.
Yes.
Because I was thinking about that, because, at the end when Carolinus' house comes flying into the kind of cleansed Omedan's realm, and it's spinning just like the house of the Wizard of Oz. And I was like, that's got to be deliberate.
Yeah.
Like, that's got to be a little nod there, hasn't it?
Absolutely.
But it makes it feel a bit like the 4 cardinal points of Oz, and, the way they're represented by these kind of weird women at the ends of the earth.
It's so bizarre, isn't it? Just the fact that Carolinus is aware of things like the Wizard of Oz. So these fantasy characters are aware of fantasy.
Yeah.
It's so strange to look back on it now. Of course, as you say, because it was something that I was exposed to so early, as so many of us were, you don't question it at the time. It's just the nature of the thing.
Well, they're sort of chronologically adrift, aren't they, in a more concrete way than the concept of Middle Earth in Tolkien is, because they are kind of in the far-flung past of the Earth.
Yes.
But sort of, and by the climax of the movie, they're kind of protected in like what you now call as a Doctor Who fan, like time locked, basically, But as you say, they're untethered, and they have this kind of, I guess, L-space-esque kind of awareness of other human culture and future human culture, and it's such an odd foundation for something like this.
It is very bizarre. I mean, I think Omedan is very disparaging of the concept, isn't he? He calls it a foolish retirement village.
Yeah, that's right. That's an amazing line.
It's a great line, isn't it? And then you get that wonderful laugh that James Earl Jones does, which is just the cackle that Omedan does.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's interesting actually, because you don't. I suppose if you're talking about Tolkien, that's something you don't get as much with the villains in. I'm thinking like Saruman, the more sort of relatable villains in Tolkien. You don't. Although it's always, Tolkien scholars and fans and everything always emphasize that it's the ending of the third age, and the kind of coming of this, the sort of implied coming of modernity, or at least modernity is just off stage, off in the wings. This is kind of this. It's almost a weird predestination thing, isn't it? Because they're trying to protect their world against a modernity that they already know is coming.
Yeah.
Like, it's not just come. It's not just coming.
There.
It's come.
It's there. Yeah.
It's there in the future for all to see.
It's inevitable. Yeah. They operate in this really strange non-space, which is the realm of human fantasy in a way that doesn't exist anywhere and yet is pervasive and everywhere. It's a very strange concept. I love the sequence where he pulls Peter through into that realm via the game board.
Yes.
The flying dice. I mean, actually, that's where the film verges on the surreal.
Yeah, and it's actually a prefiguring of Jumanji as well, come to think of it.
Oh, yes, I never thought of it in those terms. But actually, if you look at the game board, it's not a million miles away either.
Yeah. I mean, that just occurred to me. So,
yeah, I never thought of it in those terms. And I love the sequence where Carolinus goes to antiquity itself, like the personification of antiquity, and asks it, who can do this? Who can actually embark on this quest? And it shows him Peter.
Yeah.
It's so strange. It's such an odd sequence. Because, of course, at that point, the film switches completely from a fantasy realm to Brooklyn.
Yeah.
In what, the 1970s, I think it is, or the early 1980s?
Well, and did you read, talking about the interplay between the fantasy world and the real world in this film? Did you read that in the book The Dragon and the George? Did you read that the not the twist, but the end of the film, where Melisande gives up her magical life to come and live with Peter in New York? Did you read that in the book they do exactly the opposite?
No.
So there's a romantic pairing like that,
right?
But I think the way the Wikipedia summary reads is they have a discussion about it, and it's like, and then they decide to live in the fantasy world. So it's basically the equivalent of staying in Narnia.
Well, yeah. I can see why they inverted that, because that would have undermined the thesis of the film. Of course, it's all about accepting reality. I mean, Peter says it at the end. He says to Omedan, "You're magic, you're illusion. I'm science, I'm logic, and the truth."
Well, it'd be even weirder if they'd essentially kidnapped the real figure Peter Dickinson and left him in a fantasy world forever.
That would be odd, wouldn't it? That would be very strange.
I like that this doesn't make sense either, but in a weird way, it kind of, we let it go because at least it leaves him in the real world.
Yeah.
It's like a secret thing that happened to Peter Dickinson one day.
I mean, that's a complex thing to throw at children as well. The notion that, there is a form of imagination, there's a form of fantasy that can be very damaging, that can be very dark and neurotic if it consumes you, if you allow it power over yourself. Funnily enough, it's something that thematically is echoed in another fantasy film of the same era, which is Labyrinth. Labyrinth has exactly the same thesis. The Goblin King, ably played by David Bowie, is that he is fantasy run amok. He is imagination that wants to dominate you and take you away from reality in all of its jags and barbs and all of its pain and its trauma. That's kind of what you've got here.
And I suppose as well, I can't remember what the protagonist in Labyrinth is called, but
Jareth.
Jennifer Connelly. Jennifer Connelly's character. She. This can be. Well, we can insert this later when one of us thinks. She, because otherwise it'll be embarrassing.
Her name is Sarah.
Sarah, yeah. Sarah. I suppose she's kind of, as a protagonist, she's kind of the same as Peter in this film in some ways, in the sense that her knowledge of fantasy and her feel for it and her soul, if you like, and stuff like that, it has to fuse with her real life hard-headedness and her common sense in order to kind of take on and defeat the magical world, kind of both on its own terms but also ultimately on hers.
Yes, that's it. It's about taking control, isn't it? It's about ultimately taking control of your imagination and utilising it, not allowing it power over you, which is what Omadon is. Omadon is explicitly dark fantasy trying to invade the minds of man and twist it to his own ends.
Well, it's funny, one bit I remember from this, and I was actually telling a colleague about, I was telling my colleague Mark about this the other day, and we both work for a university which is known for its strengths in the social sciences.
Right.
And I was watching this the other night, and I remembered the general scene where Peter defeats Omadon at the end, and how that went and stuff. I didn't remember the sort of Hydra-like heads exploding and things like that of Omadon's kind of weird tentacles, essentially.
I can do anything. Test me. Allow me to reach up and pluck down the sun.
You can't do that.
Why? Why, you insect? Why?
7 heads and each one a simpleton. Don't you know what you reach for isn't in that position anymore?
The sun is the sun. I can see where it is.
Where it was, Pipsqueak. Any schoolboy knows that light travels at 186,300 miles per second. What you see is the sun's position 8.5 minutes ago.
No magic but mine can move the sun. I command it.
Not magic, gashead. Mathematics. And that's the answer to why antiquity chose me. You are magic, mere illusion. I am science, logic, and the truth. You don't frighten me. Nothing so horrible could be real. I deny you.
Deny me, and you deny all magic. Say it then.
I deny all magic.
I remembered some of the incantations of kind of equations and things that Peter uses against him, and scientific theorems and things like that. But I didn't remember that he just starts, as the sort of death blow, he just starts recounting fields of human endeavour.
Yeah.
And I laughed out loud when he almost as like as the coup de grace, he's like, and sociology, and Omadon like screams and explodes and dissolves. It's given how into sociology my place is, and also sort of the sort of cultural, I guess you might say, political resonances of sociology as a field. I was just like, that's amazing.
Yeah, right.
He blew him up with sociology.
Yeah, it's so cool, isn't it? It's so cool. I love that dynamic at the end, and the way he shrieks. James Earl Jones shrieks when he dissolves. He is so feeling it.
Yeah, he is, and it's also like, we talked before about the wizards and their kind of knowledge of our world. Like, what does it mean that he's saying these things, and just saying them defeats him?
Yeah.
It's kind of because obviously they nicely parallel. It's his own sort of incantation.
Yeah, that's it. It's so clever, isn't it? He's actually using Omadon's own rules against him.
Well, I love the bit when I'd completely forgotten about this, at least consciously, but the bit when Omadon's like, I could reach out and tear down the sun or whatever, and Peter's like, it's not where it was when you saw it 8 minutes ago, whatever. I can't remember what the exact things he says, but he's using the speed of light, the knowledge of the speed of light, to say that just wouldn't work.
He's saying you
anyway.
can't do that. It's impossible. You can't do that. Yeah. And Omadon gets really het up about it, doesn't he? He's like, the sun is the sun. I can see where it is.
Well, it's like Smeargle. He's like the less benevolent form of Smeargle in that sense, isn't he? He's like this world works, and I know how it works, and I don't need anyone re-explaining it to me.
Actually, as Peter points out, he is actually more ignorant in his way than many children.
Yeah. But it's also the thing where they're kind of, I don't want to come across as an Omadon stan here, but I like that thing of like, they're kind of both right though. Like the they are. This is where you get that rounded thing, isn't there? Peter is in a magical world,
right?
Loads of crazy stuff's happening.
Yep.
You know, despite I guess you say the Dickinsonian attempts to explain elements of it, there is also just loads of crazy stuff happening.
Yeah. There's just magic. In that world, I mean, that's part of that's where the conversation gets really complex, isn't it? Because in that world, the rules that Peter is describing aren't universally applicable. We know they're not. He's been running around with a wolf that was drowned and dead and is not anymore.
Yeah. For example, just to take one example, well, the sand mercs, right?
Right.
Because I mean, you know what that actually really reminded me of this time, the intensity and weirdness of it. It reminded me of.
It's horrific, isn't it?
It's really bad. I mean, it reminded in a less physically invasive way. It reminded me of the worms from Star Trek II: Wrath of Khan, the sort of the literal earworms that drive people mad.
Yeah, there is something really unpleasant. I remember when I was a kid, a lot of my friends really hated the Sandmerc sequence.
Yeah,
because it looks it's a horrible notion. It's a horrible concept. The fact that these things can drive you mad by chittering and chattering from the shadows.
Well, so they're just doing that as well. It's not like they're even doing that till one of them can eat you or whatever. No. It's just like they're just doing that, and it's sort of drilling away at your head. And I think I just found something about the fact that Peter as Gorbash and Neville Smythe are both singing these songs.
But you know what I love about that? Do you know the song that Sir Oren Neville Smythe is singing?
It's like, well, it sounds like an old sort of ballad.
It's Lude Sinkuku. It's the oldest known song. It's an actual song. It's the oldest known pagan song. It's the song that the residents of Summerisle sing at the end of The Wicker Man when Howie is burning to death.
Oh, that's an incredible parallel.
Lude Sinkuku. It is summer is a coming in.
I like that. I wonder if any of the animators had seen The Wicker Man.
Later, I mean, obviously as a kid I didn't. You don't get this, but like later on, watching it, I was like, so he is the archetype of a Christian knight, right? Mm-hmm. And he's singing this incredibly pagan song. Where did that come from? What's
going on? Yeah. Well, I suppose that's where you get the Arthurian feel of it and stuff as well, isn't it? With all the stuff mixed into the sword and the stone.
I want to know why and where that came from. Why Lude Sinkuku is the song that he goes for.
No, that'd be fascinating. I mean, I really like, the actor who plays. I was looking into, we talked about James Earl Jones, but some of the voice actors in it. The guy who plays Peter Dickinson is called John Ritter.
John Ritter, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, who had a really storied career, didn't he?
Yeah.
Until he died relatively young, I think, in the noughties. Mm-hmm. But he, I think he's known most to American audiences for being in the sitcom Three's Company.
Yeah, that's right.
And certainly would have been at this time. That would have been, I think it maybe had just wrapped up, but it was kind of to an early 80s audience. That would have been some of the more impressive stunt casting, but there's kind of a lot of old TV personalities in this and stuff. People from MASH and Gunsmoke and stuff. But did you see, you probably have, but did you see what John Ritter went on to do in 1990?
1990, what did he do?
He's in It.
Yes, that's right. Yes, he's in the TV adaptation of It. Yes.
Yeah. Which I saw that and I just thought it was something I obviously had to mention to you. But then I was like, that's weird, isn't it? Because in that it's all about having these irrational creatures that you've got to kind of fight with a sort of childish yet rationality.
Right, and about the power of imagination and fear. And I mean, Pennywise is so like Omadon in that regard, isn't he? He's so like Omadon.
In that respect, at least, yeah. And the conflict is framed that way.
Yeah, how bizarre. How very strange that this guy is in both of these products, which are so thematically similar.
And which is sort of so unlike what he made his name in as well.
Right.
But it's such a good... and also just what a great performance in voicing a real-life author protagonist and also voicing him when he's turned into a dragon and making both of them appealing and believable.
Yeah, right. I mean, that is one of the weirder elements in this film. There is that moment when, for reasons, Peter is magically fused with Gorbash. And Peter Dickinson's mind takes over the body of the dragon and doesn't know what to do with it.
Yeah. I love how weirdly awkward that is as well, because the person who realizes it is Melisande, but he's like, she only resisted because he's like, we just kissed.
Yeah.
And then she's like, oh my god.
Oh my god. Yeah.
Yeah,
it is
so
very strange, isn't it? It is very strange. I mean, there are moments in this film that are weird. I mean, there's the Danielle of the Woodlands who turns up, the basically female Robin Hood. She's female Robin Hood. And she and Oren Neville Smythe get on very well. And there's a sequence, one of the more horrific sequences in the film, actually, which is when Omadon sends the Ogre of Gormley Keep to, which is, I have a cousin, and we loved this film when we were kids. We were very, very close, still are now. He was so terrified of that sequence. He used to have nightmares about it. The sequence where Omadon sends the Ogre of Gormley Keep to basically to capture the members of the party, and there's this weird. It's so oddly put together, that sequence where they're recounting what happened. And it's all in black and white. You only see the ogre in silhouette. You see bits and pieces of him. It's properly horrific. But if you look, Danielle and Sir Oren are in the same bed together. And there is before that, when they're in the inn, Danielle says to him, as they're getting up to go to bed, "For we may not see another night."
Yeah.
So there is an implication there, which is rather interesting.
That's nicely done, isn't it? And so unusual.
So odd. For not just any children's media of the era, just any children's media at all, to even imply. Very cool.
Yeah, no. Well, it's still quite unusual. These, even in contemporary superhero movies and stuff. I remember there's the bit in the 2017 Wonder Woman, for example, where it's not very explicit or lingered on, but Wonder Woman and Steve Trevor do sleep together. Like that happens, and that's still so unusual to see in a movie that is large, well, aimed at a family audience, shall we say, to use the old parlance. To even just hint strongly that happened is kind of breaking.
Yeah, but it's very beautifully framed here. I mean, you wouldn't notice it. I certainly didn't notice it as a child, but you do notice it as an adult, and it's just well done.
There's two bits in that ogre sequence which really, I said in DMs, I said one of the bits that made me laugh a lot is when they wake up in the room, because Peter Gorbash and Smeargle have been getting drunk.
They've been getting drunk, and they've been
dragon drunk.
Yeah, it's so funny, isn't it? It is so brilliant.
That bit could be a whole episode if this was a series. That'd be amazing. But they're singing like actual real world songs and stuff like that.
Peter is teaching Smeargle real songs.
Amazing, like hillbilly drinking songs and stuff. It's incredible. But the bit I love is they wake up in the ruins of the tavern, and Peter Gorbash is like, what happened? And Smeargle, obviously thinking that it was them, is just like, don't say anything.
Yeah, don't admit to anything.
Don't admit to anything. Like they've been pulled over by the cops.
Yeah.
Just like,
so
that's
funny.
Such a funny line. But the bit I remembered that really kind of struck the fear of God into me, I guess, when I was a kid was the whole battle with the ogre on the battlements that follows.
Yeah.
And I was mentioning George R. R. Martin before. There's something about the physicality of that battle that Smeargle specifically says, like, don't let him get a grip on you. And it was reminding me of the Mountain and the Viper. It was reminding me of that this is a really dangerous guy, and if your main advantage on him is your agility.
Yeah.
But a dragon is this big kind of winged bat creature, so if something strong gets a hold of you, you're done for. And I was just like, that's horrible. That's a real.
And there is a moment where he does get a hold of Peter and Gorbash, and it looks like it hurts.
Well, yeah, it's just like it's so unglamorous, isn't it? He's just going to crush the life out of you now.
Yeah, I mean,
it's not like there's going to be nothing more to it.
He's big and ugly and just this brutish thing, isn't he? There's no elegance to the way he fights. He just grabs you and crushes you.
Yeah, and he's fireproof as well. They make a point of, you bring that blast fire into his face, and he's just
not going to work. Not going to work.
Yeah.
He's a horrific creature. He really is. That's the fight sequence, and of course it's very sad as well. I mean, you have the death of Smeargle at that point.
How does it make you care about that so much when you've only known Smeargle as a concept for about an hour?
Yeah, right.
It's crazy, isn't it? Like how they can make you so invested, as a kid especially.
I think it's even sadder because, of course, Carolinus is monitoring what's happening via Melisande. Melisande is having visions as the quest is going on, and Carolinus learns of Smeargle's death through that distant medium. And of course, they've been friends for centuries. It's implied for centuries. It's very, very sad.
Yeah, it's really. I mean, that is just such a brilliant performance. The guy who voices Smeargle, whose name I have in front of me is James Gregory, who also does Briarg, by the way.
It does Briarg as well, right? Okay, interesting.
That's kind of amazing.
Yeah, that is very impressive. Two markedly different characters with markedly different voices.
It's only in discussing this with you that I realised how much it must have got under my skin and kind of provided a bit of a a kind of gateway and foundation for other things as well. Like, I think one sort of larger point I wanted to make was, because I mentioned Pratchett before, is I think, so I'm like a lot of people, I'm a kind of, childhood and adolescent sci-fi and to a lesser extent fantasy fan. But I was starting to think of the difference between those two things a little bit because, at least in terms of my encountering them and passing them, because I was thinking that whilst I come by science fiction in a sense honestly via a lot of kind of, like sorts of serious sci-fi sources, pulpy ones, but, like things like Star Trek and Asimov and Heinlein and stuff like that. I come by a lot of fantasy via parody and via meta playing about with it and via things like this and via Pratchett and I was thinking it's a bit like, because I'm a childhood Star Trek fan, but it's a bit like if I wasn't and instead the first thing I'd seen had been Galaxy Quest and then had gone back and watched Star Trek. It's kind of it's such a different route for me.
It's bizarre, isn't it? I mean, I'm exactly the same. I would have encountered this before I encountered things like The Lord of the Rings.
Sure, yeah.
This is deconstructing in a way. It's totally deconstructing that kind of fantasy.
That's a similarity we have then, I think, in the sense that, in a sense, how do you then go back and take that other stuff seriously? And I think when it came to things like watching the Lord of the Rings movies, it was the utter majesty and sincerity of them, I guess, that got me. And obviously there's a whole other episode of this podcast talking about Gormenghast. So let's,
yes.
I'm not going to drag you back into that Vietnam that you have going on. But if anyone wants to hear me and George's thoughts on Gormenghast, they are sizable. And I'll provide a link. But you know what I mean? It's kind of...
It is an odd route,
I've come to it through this weird gauze,
It is really strange. I mean, I would have been watching The Flight of Dragons at the same time as I was reading The Chronicles of Narnia and watching the BBC adaptations of The Chronicles of Narnia. And yet, I know for a fact that in my childhood mind, in my imagination, there was no clear distinction between them as two different types of fantasy. They just were.
Well, this has... I mentioned Narnia briefly before, but this Flight of Dragons, at the film version at least, has that thing where, in common with Narnia and not in common with Lord of the Rings and Gormenghast, where there is an interaction with the quote-unquote real world.
Yes, with a real world, which is not something you get in the Lord of the Rings, or indeed in Gormenghast.
And I think, to be fair to C.S. Lewis, because let's face it, we've both been very unfair to C.S. Lewis on a number of occasions, and fair, I suppose, as well.
I was going to say, I think I've been very fair to C.S.
You think you've been stringently fair to C.S. Lewis, yeah. You should hear what he says about you, by the way.
Yeah, I can imagine what he would say about me. I don't need to... I can imagine.
I'm having him on next week.
Wow.
We're talking about seances, it's in a sense, Flight of Dragons, without sounding grandiose about it, has this kind of complicated philosophical relationship with the real world and between the real world and the fantasy world in the same way that the Narnia books have, and which obviously is astonishingly complicated and problematic and everything. But in Flight of Dragons, as we were saying before, it's kind of arguably a bit more benevolent and
a bit
rounded,
more mature in many respects. I mean, in many respects, if you look at the metaphysics of the Chronicles of Narnia, how they ultimately end, they end with surrendering to the fantasy. You collapse into the fantasy world and you stay a child forever, and that's celebrated as a wonderful and brilliant thing. Whereas The Flight of Dragons says, no, you don't allow for that. You take control. You grow up. You become an adult.
Well, I know I've made this point to you before, but I would in Narnia's defense, I would say that that's one of the things that makes The Last Battle a really good horror story.
Yeah,
but you're right, it is a horror though, isn't it? It is the collapse into fantasy, a total collapse into fantasy with no escape route is a horror.
I remember even as a kid, I found that horrific. I didn't know why. I couldn't articulate it to myself, but I remember reacting very badly to it.
Well, I suppose it's like if this, as you say, that the moral of this is not to stay in the fantasy world. It's actually a weird kind of segregation. It's like you have to choose eventually, isn't it? You don't have to be on either side of the divide, but you do have to end up on one side of it.
Yeah. The message of The Flight of Dragons seems to be that you need fantasy. You need imagination. It's part of the human process. It's part of who we are, but you don't surrender to it. You don't allow it to cloud your thinking. You don't allow it to overtake your judgment.
Nice place to visit, I suppose you might say.
Yeah, I suppose in a way, yeah. Whereas C.S. Lewis is about the utter retreat into it.
Yeah, although I suppose, again, not to reiterate this, I suppose for Lewis that's the truth, isn't it?
Yeah.
The capital T truth.
Yeah.
So it's got this, what we see, what you and I see as the retreat into fantasy is for him a further up and farther in, to paraphrase him.
Yeah, and the worst thing about it is and this probably didn't come across in my Narnia retrospectives because I was so angry in my last battle.
you are enjoyably
I was
angry.
properly angry at that. There is an ambiguity in the metaphysics there. There is something I appreciate about it. I like the transcendental nature of it, where you are progressing to another state of reality. I like that. I actually really like that as a metaphysical concept. What I don't like about it is that, in Lewis's sense, that other stage of reality is not more complex. It's not more ambiguous. It's more absolute.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's just incurable in it, isn't it? I mean, that's just something that can't, well, without a radical rewrite, couldn't be subtracted from it.
Yeah, it's part and parcel of his theology, and in many respects, I mean, you've got to appreciate that the books are stronger for having it. They are. They're stronger for having that theological resonance in them. Otherwise, they would just be fantasy stories, you know? But I just dislike the theology.
I wonder. Well, exactly. Well, so do I. I wonder if, not to read too much into it, but I wonder if there's something about the weird fusion of this movie of those two books. Because the Dragon and the George also involves, the interaction of the real world and a fantasy world, but and in a sort of Narnia-esque way, the human characters visit it and become lost in it in a sense. But I wonder if it's the infusion of the real Peter Dickinson's musings and kind of intellectual play that allow this to be this kind of interesting hybrid where rationality is infused and plays a part in a way it just wouldn't be allowed to in Narnia.
I think so, yeah. I think that is what elevates this material, because I think without that, it just wouldn't have the complexity. I don't think it would have been as interesting a work. It would have just been a fantasy story, in an era, by the way, which was replete with them. Absolutely replete with them, certainly in animated form.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's I'm just so glad to have revisited it. It's really interesting. I should say, the last time I watched this was before this week was about 10 years ago. And
wow! So I mean, I've seen it many times. It's a feel-good film for me.
I think I saw it like 50 times, between the age of 6 and 10, and then not till about 2011. Which I should thank my former colleague Janet, by the way. Hi, Janet, for in the unlikely event you're listening to this. Thanks for lending me also a copied DVD, actually, which was lovely. But one thing I meant to mention this earlier when we were talking about video stores and video rental, but one thing about Flight of Dragons is that we never owned it. At least you owned a taped copy.
It's phenomenally hard to find, even now. It's phenomenally hard to find. There is a DVD. You can get a DVD of it, but it's one of those made-to-order DVDs.
Right, got you.
So it's very bad. It's not well put together. The cover art for the DVD is awful.
Yeah, well, I've seen that. Yeah, it makes
it's awful.
It does make it look like something like the Black Cauldron or something, doesn't it?
Right.
Like,
And also, it's clearly by someone who's never seen the film. Carolinus is purple. Smeargle is like all these weird colours. It's just strange. It's just odd,
That's so weird. I mean, I actually wonder whether the VHS copy we rented over and over and over and over again from a small video rental shop in Fife in Scotland was just a taped off the TV version. Cause it might have been, for all I know,
Do you know what's really strange? The Last Unicorn, the sister film to The Flight of Dragons, has this incredible dedicated DVD that has voice commentary, has all sorts of making-of featurettes. I don't understand why The Flight of Dragons doesn't have that. I mean, they could the amount of money they could have made selling that as a double pack.
You'd think for nostalgia alone, right? I wonder if I wonder if there's something about the book sourcing that makes it weirdly rights laden or something.
I'm thinking there's something. There is definitely something why this has not gotten a properly dedicated DVD, Blu-ray, because the appetite is there. I certainly discovered, I mean, for me it was when I started to operate on the internet a bit more and operate in fan cultures for nostalgia. I started to realise that people love this film. People have this real connection to this film. There is a fan base out there for it, and people are quite fervent about it, So it's there. It's just not being produced for some bizarre reason. It's really strange.
Oh well, there you go. Join the petition. We'll post that in the notes.
Yeah, it's odd. It's like that TV show Nightmare from when we were kids. Huge audience for that. I mean, absolutely enormous audience for that, to the point whereby there is now a Nightmare Life show that tours the country and always sells out, but there's no dedicated DVD set or Blu-ray set or even release anywhere for that series.
Nightmare, I know that's a passion of yours. Nightmare, and I watched it a hell of a lot back in the day. That's a weird parallel with Flight of Dragons as well, isn't it? You know, you've got Traegar, who's the person, the mysterious person, magical person, but who can't get involved. And needs a human champion to go off and do the quest.
Bizarrely, there's even an overlap in terms of the themes because they were required to say that everything in the dungeon is imaginary.
Right.
So as a kind of, they're actually talking to the audience and saying, don't worry, although the dungeoneers die, quote unquote, they're not dead. Mm-hmm. You know, it's not real.
But do you think that's in the same way that in Willy Wonka it's a bit less than convincing? You know, like, don't worry, they're not dead. He just got sucked up a pipe into boiling chocolate. You know, that's fine. That's fine. It's funny, isn't it? The crown, from what I remember of Nightmare, the crown of Obadon sounds like it definitely could have been one of their like quest objects. You know,
one of their quest objects. Funnily enough, yeah. And I mean, that's another one of the weird things about this film. It is structured in such a traditionally fantasy way, in the sense that you are gathering a party of heroes who are going on a quest to get an evil magical item from a dark sorcerer, and yet around this there are these layers of wonderful complexity and thematics and whatnot going on. It's very, very cool.
It's very cool, and well, that's great, George. I think we'll leave it there. But that was fantastic to have a natter about that.
Yeah, it's always lovely to go back. The Flight of Dragons is one of those things I'll talk about ad infinitum forever and ever and a day, because I love it. It's just as an aside, one of the things I love about it so much is the fact that, unlike a lot of nostalgic material that doesn't really stand up to an adult viewing, it's actually really impressive.
Well, it's definitely differently interesting as well, isn't it? It's got those the slight layers of irony and kind of, as I say, nice scripting and thematic stuff that don't. I think some of that does. More of that reaches you as a kid than most people would acknowledge, I think, but certain elements don't, of course, and it's
of course,
and it's fascinating.
It's a really strange piece of work, and I would certainly advise anyone out there who hasn't seen it, go and take a look. Yeah,
definitely, yeah. I may, there's a site that rhymes with Meili Doshin, and I might post it. I might post it, which is certainly how I may have watched it this time around. So I'll post a link, if indeed such a thing exists. George, would you like to tell people what you've been up to, where they can find you, that kind of thing?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, I've recently had one of my short story collections published by Perpetual Motion Machine Publications. That's Born in Blood Volume 2. You can also get a bundle pack of Volumes 1 and 2, which, besides it being a little bit more money for me, I would highly recommend. You can find links to all of my short story collections and published work over at strangeplaygrounds.com. And if you like podcasts, let's plays, reviews, all manner of material, you can find over at the Exaggerated Elegy channel on YouTube.
Thank you very much. Very succinct. And with that, we'll leave you. I wonder if I'll get away with playing a bit of the Don McLean theme tune.
Oh, yes, I wonder.
Yeah.
I wonder. Without being struck down.
Yeah, if you listen to this episode and you hear any of it, yes, I have to this far got away with it. If not, if the show is now unfindable on the internet, I did not get away with it.
Brilliant.
So with that in mind, see you later.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to the EscapeGoat podcast, hosted by David Fagiani. If you want to contact the podcast with any feedback or thoughts, you can leave comments on our Libsyn page or under our YouTube videos, or email us at escapegoatpod@gmail.com. You can also reach the show on Twitter on @egoat_pod and follow us for new episode notifications. This podcast is available on YouTube, Apple Podcasts and Spotify, as well as our Libsyn site, escapegoatpodcast.libsyn.com. Original intro, outro, and any other incidental music for this podcast is composed, produced, and made available by permission of Richard Gilbert.